If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 41. I was waiting for you to say that. After completely renovating, or rather, rebuilding Hagrid's hut, Kasenhis returned to his relaxed, laid-back lifestyle. Previously, Longbottom Manor had praised Neville, but it wasn't really a boast. He had indeed helped Hagrid expand the house and wrapped gifts for his students. I did return gifts to my friends in the Muggle world, so theoretically I didn't deceive him. Yes, flawless logic. The Christmas holiday passed so quickly, even Kasen hadn't had a good rest yet, although he rested for 4 days out of 7 days a week. In any case, the students soon returned to Hogwarts aboard the whaling train, and Kasenhis found himself seated in Professor McGonagall's office. At the moment, McGonagall was holding a form in her hand, a request for Kasenhis to take the 4th-year students out of school to attend the European Alchemy Exchange Association's event. When he applied for the 7th years to leave earlier, McGonagall had approved it almost instantly. However, now with the 4th years, she glanced at the form, then at Kasenhis. Then back at the form, and back at Kasenhis again. Honestly, you don't need to go this far, Professor Kasenhis. You don't have to let these students share the credit for your achievements or give away the honor that rightfully belongs to you. You're their professor, not their parent. This isn't your responsibility. Kasenhis stared at McGonagall with a peculiar expression. Because the way she looked at him was equally strange, indescribable, but definitely odd. The emotions in Professor McGonagall's gaze were complex: sympathy, perhaps, feeling distressed, or well, helpless, but also a little pride on him. Kasenhis had no idea what kind of strange narrative McGonagall had concocted in her mind, but he knew one thing for certain: he needed this form approved today. Afterward, he planned to deliver the exciting news to the students and, starting tomorrow, personally guide their attire selection. After all, they weren't 7th years, 4th years, in his eyes, were still immature little fledglings. In fact, a fair number of them were practically still at the stage of playing in the mud and drawing stick figures on parchment. Letting them handle their own outfits? Forget about them becoming elegant ladies and gentlemen, he was more worried about them showing up with pumpkin juice stains from breakfast still smeared on their collars. It was a very real concern. I still don't agree with what you're doing, McGonagall finally said, her tone firm. I understand you're trying to add a shining highlight to their resumes, but it's essentially piggybacking off your own achievements. It's not reflective of their actual accomplishments, and, frankly, it's unfair to you. I don't think it's that bad, Kasenhis replied with a shrug, entirely nonchalant. I give them the finished product, have them analyze the principles behind it, and write it into papers. They're helping me out, not stealing my glory. To be honest, I can't be bothered to write all those papers myself. McGonagall nodded, a faint smile playing at her lips. I wish I could say I had a hand in teaching you. With that, she signed her name on the form. I'll take that as a compliment, Kasenhis said, grinning ear to ear. Taking the signed form, he left McGonagall's office in high spirits and made a beeline for the alchemy classroom, his mind already buzzing with plans for what lay ahead. After arriving at the classroom, Kasenhis stepped up to the podium, only to be greeted by the sight of a group of lifeless, dejected students. What's with the gloomy atmosphere? Can someone tell me what's going on? Cedric, the designated 4th-year alchemy class representative, reached into his pocket and pulled out a copy of the Daily Prophet. Under the watchful eyes of the entire class, he placed it on the podium. What's with all the mystery? Kasenhis muttered as he picked up the paper and glanced at it. A moment later, he let out a disappointed sigh. I thought they might have cooked up something exciting, but this. He jabbed a finger at the headline on the front page, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The article was straightforward. It accused Dumbledore, painted as a senile old man, of forcing the new alchemy professor to share his achievements with students just so Hogwarts could maintain its prestige. Ordinarily, scandals involved unscrupulous professors stealing their students' work and taking credit for it. But this time, the narrative had flipped. The supposedly unscrupulous headmaster and the students had collectively stolen the poor professor's achievements. You guys, Kasenhis looked out at the students below the podium. Honestly, do you think this article is useful in any way? Anyone with half a brain can see it's not about me or you, it's about someone with an agenda taking a swing at Dumbledore. If Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs can't see through it, I get it. But Ravenclaws and Slytherins? Why do you all look like you actually believe the nonsense this rag is spouting? To his surprise, the Slytherin and Ravenclaw students, instead of looking chastened, inexplicably straightened their postures with an air of pride. Kasenhis stood on the podium, momentarily stunned. He couldn't help but wonder if his students were all imbued with some kind of strange charm that erased the aesthetic of intelligence. Below the podium, the students also seemed to realize something, and one by one, their previously proud postures deflated. All right, this is a matter between Dumbledore and the Ministry of Magic. No need for me to get involved. The main reason I called you here, even though there's no class today, is to make an announcement. Your paper on the enchantment table has officially passed the European Alchemy Association's review. Tomorrow night, get yourselves ready, dress properly, and come find me for a final check on your attire. We'll be leaving this weekend. Any issues? The students shook their heads in perfect unison. No issues? Great. You're dismissed. I won't take up any more of your free time. With that, Kasenhis left the classroom without another glance at the students. He had more pressing matters to attend to. On his way back to his office, he happened to run into Dumbledore. Frustrated face, stare. Why are you looking at me like that? Dumbledore tilted his head, a bit puzzled. Weren't you just slandered by that shameless journalist? How are you still strolling around so leisurely? Kasenhis asked. Oh, how does the saying go? Idle chatter abounds, pay it no mind, and it fades away. I simply don't have the energy to worry about such trivial matters. You're that magnanimous. What else could I be? More staring. Oh fine. After all, I'm a renowned and seasoned wizard. Any reaction I make will ripple outward, so when faced with situations like this, all I can do is swallow my grievances and keep moving forward, Dumbledore admitted frankly. Ah, how pathetic. The old man with the silver beard smiled, gently placing a hand on Kasenhis' shoulder. I was just waiting for you to say that. Chapter 42. Still want to run away? I was waiting for you to say that. Kasenhis' mouth twitched. I shouldn't have said anything earlier, should I? Honestly, Dumbledore, you're someone I've always seen as incredibly magnanimous. In my mind, you're as towering as Mount Everest and as sweet as the Alps. Haha. Dumbledore patted Kasenhis on the shoulder affectionately. That's exactly it, Kasenhis. You're the same. To me, you're like the sun, warm and selflessly illuminating every corner of Hogwarts, caring for students, uniting the staff, and even... Wait. Kasenhis gestured for a pause. No matter what you say, I won't. Dumbledore, you weren't planning to remodel your office into a standalone tower earlier, were you? You'd agree. Kasen paused. Dumbledore clasped his hands behind his back and tilted his head at a dramatic 45-degree angle toward the ceiling. Say, if that Rita Skeeter happened to run into some unforeseen incident. Like, oh, I don't know, a random encounter with some ruffians who broke into her home and gave her a little lesson, hypothetically speaking. I need her address. What address? Dumbledore, without missing a beat, feigned total ignorance. All right then. Kasenhis rolled his eyes and decided to ask someone else. Meanwhile, Dumbledore grinned, flashing that distinctively sly smile only he could manage. Think you can cross the headmaster and get away with it? After enduring public criticism from that journalist for so long, Dumbledore had his reasons for not retaliating. First, his every action could set off a chain reaction he truly couldn't afford to act rashly. Second, all the professors at Hogwarts, along with his friends outside the school, knew his character well enough to ignore petty attacks. Why waste energy on something as juvenile as revenge? But now? Now he had Kasenhis, a man with overwhelming power, a straightforward mind, and, most importantly, someone who wasn't entirely familiar with Dumbledore's personality. Perfect. Knock, knock, knock. Come in. Professor McGonagall, looking utterly puzzled, watched as Kasenhis entered. It wasn't until she noticed the newspaper in his hand that realization dawned. You don't need to get involved in this, McGonagall began. Dumbledore has already gone to the Ministry of Magic to speak with Fudge and Skeeter. I believe the matter will be resolved soon. He spoke with them? Just now he was in the hallway, chatting with me. Ah? Perhaps he asked you to go find Skeeter. Not at all. Absolutely not. Kasenhis shook his head firmly. Stare. All right, fine. Dumbledore promised me I could turn my office into a standalone tower, Kasenhis admitted with a sigh. Okay, fair enough. No one would say no to that, McGonagall replied, understanding his decision. So, how do you plan to handle this? Meet her in person and give her a beating. I knew it, McGonagall said, shaking her head, exasperated. I need her home address, Kasenhis added, looking at McGonagall with an expression so expectant that it made her slightly uneasy. She composed herself quickly, pressing her lips together. Theoretically, I shouldn't help you with this. Besides, I genuinely don't know where she lives. And practically, you could write a letter to Rita Skeeter. All communal owls in the Olary are enchanted with name-based magic. If they can't find the recipient's address, they'll use the name magic to locate her home. Also, this name-based magic is only available on the communal owls from the Olary, McGonagall added with a pointed look. Oh, got it, Kasenhis muttered as he returned to his office. He pulled out a piece of parchment and, after contemplating for a while, wrote, True Self in 3 seconds or less. Then, he took out an ender pearl and set up a small mechanism. As soon as the envelope was opened, the pearl would shatter. He. Kasenhis chuckled sinisterly. After dispatching a communal owl to deliver the letter, Kasenhis folded his arms and stood in his office. By evening, feeling that the time was right, he picked up a baseball bat from the corner of the room. This particular item was a big treasure confiscated from the Weasley twins. Every time it hit something, it caused a small explosion hit, boom, hit, boom. Kasenhis had originally confiscated it because of its danger, but now, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to put it to use. Meanwhile, Rita Skeeter, having spent her day churning out sensational stories at the Daily Prophet, returned home and emptied her mailbox. One particular letter stood out. It felt strange, with a spherical object inside. After a moment of silence, her instincts kicked in. She dragged out an enormous explosion-proof container from the corner of her room. It was nearly as tall as she was, with a small piece of blast-resistant glass embedded in the front. Using magic, she carefully levitated the suspicious envelope into the container and then ripped it open. Swoosh! In an instant, Kasenhis materialized inside the container, looking bewildered. Rita Skeeter approached with a smug smile, folding her arms. She tapped on the explosion-proof glass twice with her lacy gloves, the sound echoing mockingly. You think I wouldn't anticipate someone coming for me? Using such a cheap trick, a reverse portkayat, no less. You think I can't get out? Kasenhis calmly retorted from inside the explosion-proof container. He lightly tapped the interior wall twice, thunk, thunk, and a 2x1 opening suddenly appeared. He swung the baseball bat in his hand, producing a series of pop 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 explosions. Boom! With a friendly yet firm discussion, Kasenhis soon dragged a bruised and battered Rita Skeeter out of her own house. Holding a diamond shovel in one hand, he headed toward a small wooded area nearby and began digging. It didn't take long before a 2x1x2 pit was carved out of the ground. My dear reporter, I'm confident you'll grow to love your new accommodations, Kasenhis said, clutching the back of Rita's robe before casually tossing her into the hole. He then started filling it back up with dirt. P.S. What the F is happening in this FIC? LOL. The soil was loose and breathable, and considering the resilient vitality of wizards, she'd probably dig her way out by morning, assuming it didn't rain, of course. But come on, it was December. Where would rain come from this time of year? Surely not. That'd just be absurd. After patting the dirt off his hands, Kasenhis turned to leave, ready to head back to Hogwarts and inform Dumbledore that his real-world justice had been thoroughly delivered. Just as he stepped into Dumbledore's office, though, he glanced out the window and saw rain pouring in sheets. It's late December. Where on earth is this rain coming from? Bloody England! Kasenhis let out an exasperated screech before disappearing in a burst of purple light and a thunderous boom. After all, Rita Skeeter, for all her sensationalist mischief, was only guilty of a bit of verbal sparring in print. Annoying, sure. But hardly deserving of a death sentence. Chapter 43 Gryffindors. Oh, Gryffindors! Ha! Ha! I was wrong. I swear, I'll never run my mouth in the papers again, truly. Nearly suffocated in the muddy rain-soaked ground, Rita Skeeter lay sprawled in the muck, sobbing and wailing in remorse. Kasenhis, meanwhile, calmly tucked away his shovel and disappeared from the quiet little forest in the blink of an eye. Well, at least Skeeter hadn't seen his face when the bat had a friendly chat with her. She probably wouldn't go to the ministry about it. Probably. Back at Hogwarts, Kasenhis shook off his raincoat and strolled into Dumbledore's office. With a flourish, he placed his pre-prepared office expansion request form squarely on Dumbledore's desk. And that read a Skeeter. At the very least, she should keep quiet for a good while. Haha. Dumbledore nodded and signed his name on the form. Would you like me to arrange a construction team for you? No need, I'll handle it myself, Kasenhis replied. Oh, by the way, the expanded building will need to match Hogwarts-style black stone walls and all that. Don't worry, I'm a professional. That's better. Humming a cheerful tune, Kasenhis returned to his office and unrolled a sheet of parchment to start designing his new space. Perhaps it could. Knock, knock, knock. You would come at this time? Come in. Professor? Your office. Neville stepped inside, followed by Harry and the others. Kasenhis quickly rolled up the rough sketch he'd been working on and instead reached for the teapot. Neville, wearing the memory bracelet Kasenhis had gifted him, took a seat on the sofa. Meanwhile, Ron, already munching on some snacks, was proudly sporting his new robes. But Neville's expression was a mix of hope and disappointment as he glanced at Kasenhis. First, the wizard robe he had gifted the professor wasn't being worn. Second, the promised office expansion he had heard about at the Longbottom estate. Well, the office didn't appear to have expanded even a single square meter. A wave of dejection tightened Neville's face. Neville, what are you thinking about? Your face is all scrunched up. Professor, didn't you say you were going to expand your office during the holidays? Unfortunately, I've got a bit of a procrastination issue. It's still in the planning stage. Kasenhis quickly retrieved the design sketch and laid it on the desk to reassure the sensitive young wizard in front of him. And the new robe I gave you? I just went out, and it was pouring rain. You wouldn't want me to get that beautiful robe all dirty, would you? Kasenhis carefully deployed his well-honed verbal artistry, finally convincing Neville that he didn't dislike the robe or the idea of spending a night at the Longbottom estate. Of course, he truly wasn't fond of sleeping anywhere that wasn't his own space. Something about it always felt off. But he couldn't very well say that out loud. What if Neville got upset? He'd have to soothe him all over again. So, what brings the four of you little troublemakers here today? Kasenhis asked. Professor, do you know Nicolas Flamel? Hermione inquired. Nicolas Flamel? I don't recall including his name in the textbook I gave you. Kasenhis scratched his head. He distinctly remembered that the material he had given Hermione was just an introductory alchemy book. It only covered foundational theories and a few fun alchemical experiments not nearly advanced enough to bring up a figure like Nicolas Flamel. Not from that book, Hermione shook her head. I should have asked this all in one go. Where did you hear about that name? Kasenhis sighed. The four exchanged glances. We heard it from Hagrid. Hagrid, hey? Oh, by the way, you went to Hagrid's new house? How was it? Do you know who built it for him? Never mind, you probably can't guess it was me. Before I became a professor at Hogwarts, I was a highly skilled custom home designer. Basically, I did renovations. Professor, please don't go off topic, Hermione interrupted with a sigh. Looking at her professor, who seemed so adept at steering conversations off course, she suddenly felt like she was talking to an 11-year-old first-year student. To her, Kasenhis's attempts at deflecting and changing topics were even less convincing than Harry's well-practiced excuse to Professor McGonagall, the essay's done, I just forgot to bring it. All right, Kasenhis finally relented. Nicolas Flamel is a very famous alchemist. The only known philosopher's stone in existence was created by him. He also used it to make the elixir of life, which has supposedly kept him alive for nearly 700 years. Don't you collect chocolate frog cards? Leaning back in his chair with his hands resting on his stomach, Kasenhis appeared entirely nonchalant. If that's the case, then the thing hidden under the trapdoor must be this so-called philosopher's stone, Hermione said with conviction, her tone so serious it almost made Kasenhis laugh. How was he supposed to gently tell them that the so-called philosopher's stone was just a chunk of redstone and that he'd even given each of them a piece as a gift? Still, that amusing thought could wait. There were more pressing matters at hand. For instance, are you still investigating that trapdoor? Or are you still tracking Quirrell? Professor, do you have any tea around here? All right, where are you now in your investigation? Kasenhis sighed. When we went to have tea with Hagrid, we accidentally let slip about Quirrell being a dark wizard, Harry admitted. Hagrid didn't believe us, and I might have gotten carried away and told him that Quirrell wasn't just a dark wizard but was also trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone from the third-floor corridor. Hagrid got really flustered, said a lot of things, and then hurriedly kicked us out, Hermione added, shrugging in exasperation. And in his panic, he accidentally mentioned something about Dumbledore and Nicolas Flamel's plan and, well, Nicolas Flamel. Hagrid, and now you know what's hidden there. Do you also know what the plan is? Kasenhis sighed again. Why do you want to know our plan? So I can hear it, come up with my own plan, and counter your plan by ruining it. That doesn't sound right. Hermione said, her expression beginning to crack under the absurdity of the conversation. Will you tell me, then? The four exchanged glances and, in unison, shook their heads. No, we won't. Oh really? The four exchanged another glance, whispering among themselves for a moment, and then stood up in unison. Goodbye, Professor Kasenhis. Kasenhis's lips twitched as he watched them leave his office one after another. Gryffindors, oh, Gryffindors. Chapter 44 Hermes Medal. After sending the four little ones on their way, Kasenhis finally found himself with a bit of free time. At least for now, the only thing on his agenda was escorting the fourth-year students to receive their award. Time flew by, and the weekend arrived in the blink of an eye. When Kasenhis woke up in the morning, he noticed a set of portkeys by his bedside, accompanied by a letter from the European Alchemy Exchange Association. The language in this letter was even more cordial than the last one, a clear indication of how fond the association's bigwigs were of someone like Kasenhis, who threw out groundbreaking theses like candy. By evening, Kasenhis had gathered the fourth-year students once again, making them stand in a neat line for his personal inspection of their attire and presentation. Soon, Kasenhis found himself at the Ministry of Magic's Grand Banquet Hall. Scanning the room filled with reporters, he was pleased to note the absence of one particular individual, Rita Skeeter. Or rather, ever since the incident, her public appearances had been limited to a brief, terse statement in the Daily Prophet, mentioning her indefinite leave of absence. That's truly for the best. I really don't like her, honestly, Kasenhis remarked, leaning against one of the enormous Roman-style support columns and chatting with none other than Ollivander. Indeed, as the head of England's sole wand-making dynasty, Ollivander's presence here was anything but surprising. Agreed, Ollivander replied with a polite smile. Oh, by the way, besides the award ceremony today, there's also going to be a knighting ceremony for you. We all agreed to keep it a surprise. Does that mean I'll be getting another title to add to the collection? Not just one, but two, Ollivander said with a calm smile. One is the Hermes Medal. Hermes, as you know, is the legendary founder of alchemy. It's the highest honor in the field of alchemy. The other is the Order of Merlin, though I didn't dig into the details. Ever since a certain black bought a first-class medal with gold, the prestige of the Order of Merlin has taken a nosedive. Some even see receiving the Order of Merlin as a disgrace. Of course, not all of this can be blamed on black, it's mostly on the Ministry of Magic, Ollivander explained leisurely, laying out the context. I see, Kasenhis replied, nodding slowly. Before long, following a brief and efficient award ceremony, Kasenhis found himself being nudged onto the stage by Ollivander. You know I'm not great at public speaking, Kasenhis said, glancing sideways. Then don't speak. There aren't many alchemists who are good at it anyway. Fair point, Kasenhis admitted, shrugging. The next morning, Kasenhis stepped out wearing the dark red wizard robe Neville had gifted him. The fabric was light and soft, so much so that it felt like wearing nothing at all. Of course, that was the sensation, not the appearance. Pinned proudly to his chest was the Hermes Medal. The emblem didn't have a fixed color, instead, it shimmered with a subtle glow, resembling a slow, mesmerizing flow of molten lava. Looks good. Feeling confident, Kasenhis struck a brief pose before heading out of his office, making his way toward the classroom. Today's lesson was with the third-year students. Kasenhis had already covered the basics of alchemy with them, it was time to give them a little project. Something like figuring out how to use basic alchemy to create a totem of undying. Of course, that was an exaggeration, he wasn't that demanding. In the classroom, Kasenhis stood at the lectern. Now that you've learned the fundamental rules of alchemy, I have a small, simple project for you. Don't worry, it's straightforward. As he spoke, he clapped his hands. Out of nowhere, a glowing blue block appeared on the table. The base was made of obsidian, topped with a radiant blue core encased in a crystalline shell. "Let me show you just how incredible this little guy is," he said, gesturing for the students to step back. The students immediately got the message. Chairs screeched and desks slid as they pushed themselves and their belongings to the edges of the room. With a flick of his wrist, Kasenhis produced iron blocks. In no time, he had built a small iron pyramid in the center of the room. He placed the beacon on top and inserted an emerald into its slot. In an instant, the beacon released a brilliant beam of milky white light that shot straight into the ceiling. "Do you feel anything?" he asked, his tone expectant. The students exchanged confused looks, clearly unsure. Kasenhis scratched his chin awkwardly. "You might want to try jumping," he suggested. And so they did. Fred and George Weasley, always up for a challenge, crouched low and jumped with all their might. The next thing they knew, their heads smacked against the ceiling in a very intimate encounter. Bonk. "Let me get a picture." Slightly blurry. "All right, thanks to the Weasley gentlemen for their demonstration," Kasenhis said with a smile. "This device, which I've named the beacon, can provide various enhancements within a certain range. For example, it can make you jump higher or run faster. Of course," he continued, "it also has other, more powerful effects, such as quicker magic recovery, stronger spell potency, and even increased resilience." As he finished explaining, one of the Weasley twins raised his hand. "Go ahead," Kasenhis gestured. "Professor, why not switch it to another effect?" "Because that requires a more precious base, things like gold blocks, diamond blocks, emerald blocks, or alloy blocks," Kasenhis replied, shrugging. "And I have to take into account Hogwarts' structural integrity." He paused dramatically, then added, "Unless you're suggesting we let my alchemical creation crash through the floor and accidentally squish Professor Snape downstairs." Ha 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 ha. The classroom burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the walls. "But I don't think it's necessary. Even though Snape always looks like he's crying, he's really not worthy of death." "Oh." It was a strange sound of disappointment. Unsurprisingly, the loudest sigh came from the Weasley twins. "All right," Kasenhis continued, "let's get back on track. I'll first explain the structure of this object. You'll have the rest of this semester to write a comprehensive theoretical paper on it. Your paper will contribute directly to your final grades. Of course, this thing is incredibly complex," he added, holding up the beacon. "I don't expect you to fully unravel its mysteries in just half a term. As long as your paper is thoughtful and well argued, I'll give you credit." He leaned forward slightly and warned, "And remember, no plagiarism. Believe me, I'll meticulously review every paper. If I notice any uncanny similarities, such as what I might expect from the Weasley twins." His eyes flicked toward the pair, who suddenly sat up straighter. "I'll personally invite you to my office for an in-depth discussion about your research methodology." The class chuckled nervously. "Now," Kasenhis said, clapping his hands together, "close your books and gather around. I'll show you the inner workings of this beacon." As the students moved closer, Kasenhis casually pulled out a metal mallet. "Wait, Professor," a hesitant voice piped up. "Isn't that a little violent?" "Violent? Nah, not at all." Clang. Chapter 45. Poor Professor Kasenhis. Kasenhis and the young wizards left the alchemy classroom covered in dust and soot. Although the process had been a bit chaotic, at least they all got a good look at the nether star inside the beacon. Before leaving the classroom, Kasenhis handed each student a mini beacon as a parting gift. He had enchanted them so that they would only work when used by their rightful owner. If given to anyone else, the beacons would turn to stone, becoming completely useless, a small, thoughtful token they could use as a personal enhancement charm or pendant. By evening, after cleaning up thoroughly, Kasenhis arrived at the Great Hall. Spotting Quirrell's perpetually empty seat, he let out a satisfied hum. After dinner, Kasenhis didn't return to his office right away. Instead, he noticed Hagrid's overly conspiratorial glances and his not-so-stealthy attempts at subtlety. Curious, Kasenhis quietly followed. "I'm guessing you've found some fine wine," Kasenhis said, breaking the silence. "It's not wine though, it's even better. You'll see when we get there," Hagrid replied, his tone excited yet mysteriously coy. They soon arrived at Hagrid's newly refurbished hut, which now looked much livelier thanks to Hagrid's enthusiastic decorating. Although it didn't entirely match the original rustic style of the place, as the saying goes, happiness is what matters most. The two entered the hut and settled into the armchairs near the fireplace. It was then that Kasenhis realized why Hagrid had invited him. "Is that dragon egg of yours about to hatch?" "Forgive me, I'm completely clueless when it comes to magical creatures. Pretty much, this is the first time I've witnessed the birth of such a wonderful little life with my own eyes." Hagrid was about to say more when an untimely knock on the door interrupted him. When he opened the door, it was exactly as he expected, 4 familiar faces. "Hello, Hagrid." "Ah, hello there. But let me just say this up front, I hope you're not here today to convince me that Quirrell is a dark wizard," Hagrid said as he ushered the young wizards inside. No, we're here to apologize for my shouting last time," Harry said awkwardly. "Haha, you really don't have to do that, honestly. I'd forgotten all about it until you brought it up." "It's no big deal," Hagrid waved his hand dismissively. Once inside, the group moved to the living room and sat on the small sofas arranged around the fireplace. Only then did they notice that someone else was already there. "Oh? Hi, Professor." "Hello there. I was just guessing how long it would take for you to notice that someone's sitting here. Not bad, though your reaction time's pretty decent," Kasenhis said with a smile. "Must be because your clothes contrast too much with the sofa," Ron quipped. "Can't help it. Hagrid just loves his pink sofa." "Pfft. Hagrid is like a big baby." Harry. Don't laugh, there's nothing embarrassing about this." "Oh, yes, we're not laughing. We just thought of something funny." "What funny thing?" Hagrid asked. "Once upon a time, there was a giant, strong, and fierce-looking man, and then he liked pink bahaha." Kasenhis and Hagrid exchanged glances, both seeing the helplessness in each other's eyes. After the 4 little ones had laughed to their heart's content, Hagrid brought out a tray of rock cakes from the kitchen. Kasenhis picked one up, grabbed a cup of milk warming by the fireplace, violently broke the rock cake into pieces, and tossed them into the hot milk. This was a method he had discovered. Soaked in milk, the rock cakes were, surprisingly, quite delicious. After all, aside from being a bit overbaked, Hagrid's cookies didn't have many other flaws. Plus, he was generous with the ingredients. Watching Kasenhis eat this way, the 4 little ones picked up cups of milk, intending to place them by the fireplace to warm, and then... "Blimey! Is that a dragon egg?" Ron asked, his face frozen in disbelief. "Oh yes, keep it a secret for me." "This is a secret among the 6 of us," Hagrid said with a smile. Of course, we'll keep it a secret," Harry, Neville, and Ron all nodded in agreement. However, Hermione, still maintaining her rationality, asked, "But Hagrid, where are you planning to raise this dragon? I think I read in a book that a 3-month-old dragon could use an elephant as a snack." For a moment, the entire hut fell into a heavy silence. Hermione then turned to Kasenhis, as in her eyes, he was the most serious and reliable person in the room. Kasenhis, looking completely baffled, stared back at everyone. "Why are you all looking at me? I've never seen a dragon before. I thought the biggest they'd get was about the size of an elephant or maybe like the 3-headed dog." Hermione rolled her eyes helplessly. "Oh, dear. Maybe I could raise it in the Forbidden Forest." Hagrid mumbled. "Sure, if you're not worried about the dragon eating every living thing in the Forbidden Forest into extinction. And when it's done, it'll probably set its sights on Hogwarts," Hermione retorted. "That won't work either, Professor Kasenhis. Is there any spell to shrink it?" Hagrid asked. "A dragon's magic resistance is so high it can perfectly block even curses. Otherwise, they wouldn't be made into dragon-hide gloves." Hermione's triple verbal blow nearly knocked Hagrid's little pearls, tears, out. "Forget it, Hagrid. Even if you can't keep a dragon forever, at least this dragon is about to hatch. You just need to wait a few days and you will witness the birth of such a life. At that moment, your life and the dragon's life will have intertwined. Even if you part ways in the future, you'd have still experienced something extraordinary. That's much luckier than most people," Kasenhis said, patting Hagrid's shoulder in comfort. But as it turned out, comforting him only made things worse. Hagrid's tears flowed freely. The half-giant hugged Kasenhis, burying his head, which was even larger than Kasenhis's chest, into him and started sobbing. "Neville, all I can say is, thank goodness I wasn't wearing your robe today," Kasenhis said with a look of utter despair. "Yeah. Neville glanced at Kasenhis, whose face was full of resignation, then at the endlessly sobbing Hagrid, and nodded in agreement. Thud. Someone's outside. Harry suddenly said, alert. It's not even curfew yet, Kasenhis replied helplessly. I'll go open the door and check. Hagrid wiped his tears and stood up, leaving behind a thoroughly disheveled Kasenhis. Not long after, Hagrid brought another young wizard into the hut. The moment this person entered, the entire living room almost exploded with tension. Draco Malfoy. Malfoy scoffed, crossed his arms, and let out a disdainful snort. What's the problem? Is this some sort of forbidden area? As he spoke, he glanced around at the people in the room. He looked at Hagrid the oversized giant. He looked at Harry a clueless fool. He looked at Neville a dimwit barely better than a squib. Sure, Neville had managed to best him once. But that was just because I was careless and hadn't dodged properly. He looked at Ron a penniless pauper. He looked at Hermione and not even worth looking at. Finally, he looked at Professor Kasenhis. Draco stared at Kasenhis, especially at the wizard robe soaked with tears, and a flicker of pity appeared in his eyes. Poor Professor Kasenhis. Chapter 46 My family is quite big. Poor Professor Kasenhis. Draco looked at Kasenhis with an unusual expression of pity that had no business appearing on his face, making Kasenhis feel an eerie sense of discomfort. For the first time in his life, Kasenhis desperately wished he knew the Scour Jiffy spell. Under Draco's strange gaze, Kasenhis calmly took off his wizard robe, revealing the black shirt underneath. Malfoy, what are you doing here? The others didn't bother hiding their unfriendly expressions toward Draco. Ahem, Kasenhis suddenly coughed, drawing everyone's attention. Harry, strictly speaking, you shouldn't be saying that, since this is Hagrid's house. Hagrid, however, shrugged and said, I don't mind. I welcome all young wizards to visit me. You're a decent guy, big fella, Draco said politely, which was rare for him. All right then. Reluctantly, Harry and the others shifted on the sofa, pinching their noses as they made room for Draco. You still haven't answered my question. I came from the Quidditch pitch. I heard you all talking about a dragon, so I came to check it out. Didn't see a dragon, though, but I did see you crying pretty miserably, big fella. Hagrid awkwardly wiped the tears lingering at the corners of his eyes. You can call me Hagrid. All right, Hagrid. Yeah, so that's it. I was initially drawn here by the dragon, but when I came in, there wasn't any A long silence ensued before Draco spoke in a slightly off-tone voice, Is this a dragon egg? Yes, and it's about to hatch soon, Hagrid replied, sitting on the sofa and looking at the dragon egg in the fireplace with satisfaction. What exactly are you planning to do with it? Neville asked stiffly. Is it wrong for me to like it? Draco retorted. Just as Draco finished speaking, the dragon egg in the fireplace trembled slightly. Hagrid, watching the egg, became flustered and turned to Kasenhis. Should I put out the fire? Would it harm the little one? But Kasenhis didn't know a thing about dragons. Eventually, Draco was the one to speak. You can put out the fire now. Everyone turned to look at him, and Draco rolled his eyes. Why are you all staring at me? That dragon egg looks like it belongs to a Norwegian ridgeback. When a Norwegian ridgeback hatches, it's better if there's no fire. Although fire isn't necessarily harmful, it's still best to put it out. Hagrid nodded, reached over, and pressed a button. The flames in the fireplace were extinguished instantly, revealing 2 glowing magma blocks. Only then did Draco notice that the fireplace didn't even use fuel. After all, among the 7 people in the small hut, Hagrid, Harry, and Hermione only had a superficial understanding of alchemy. Ron, being from a poor family, had only been exposed to his twin brothers and father's amateur experiments in alchemy. As for Neville's family, there had never been any notable alchemists mentioned, and in recent years, they had gradually withdrawn from the core of the wizarding world. Draco focused his gaze on Kasenhis. This alchemist, who had received apprentice training from a young age, seemed to have the least regard for alchemy. For instance, precious alchemical artifacts had become fireplace switches, and creations that could captivate other alchemists were casually distributed to young wizards. Even his mannerisms seemed to constantly exude an effortless superiority without intention. In this hut of 7 people, Draco was the only one who truly recognized the value of such things. Professor Kasenhis, are you currently accepting custom orders for full house designs? he asked boldly. He had already prepared himself for the professor's reply to come at an emotional temperature of absolute zero. Words like a six-figure payment in galleons wouldn't have surprised him. But Kasenhis's response made Draco's mouth twitch uncontrollably. I haven't considered doing more custom designs for now, since I want to renovate Hogwarts first. Unfortunately, Dumbledore won't let me use explosives, so I have to design it bit by bit instead. What all right. Crack. The sound of eggshell breaking interrupted the conversation that was about to reignite. Everyone's gaze turned to the egg resting on the obsidian pedestal. A crack had appeared on its surface, and the fissure quickly widened. Finally, an ugly little dragon head poked out from within. Kasenhis, Hagrid, and Draco's attention were all drawn to the small, unattractive dragon head. Harry and the others huddled together, whispering softly. What should we do? I remember that Hogwarts seems to have a rule against keeping dragons, Hermione whispered. Should we remind Hagrid? Neville asked. No way. Malfoy is here. If he remembers this, he'll definitely use it to threaten us. Ron declared decisively. Then what do we do? Do nothing? He'll figure it out eventually. Ron said. Have you guys heard of the Oblivion Charm? Hermione suddenly suggested. Neville caught on, his hand creeping toward a hard, rock-like piece of Hagrid's infamous rock cake. He was ready to demonstrate a version of Obliviate powered by physics. Can't we just directly ask Professor Kasenhis to vouch for us? And Neville, could you put that rock cake down? That's not Oblivion Charm, that will be equivalent to the Killing Curse. Oops. But asking Professor to vouch. Would that work? Neville set the rock cake down. It should, right? I've noticed Professor Kasenhis gets along pretty well with Dumbledore. Just as the group was about to continue their planning, Draco interrupted. What are you lot whispering about over there? Nothing. Draco sneered and turned to Hagrid. Big guy, what are you planning to do with it? From what I know, a Norwegian Ridgeback can outgrow this house in less than a month. I'll ask Dumbledore to help me find a dragon reserve and send it there, Hagrid replied. I see. Well, my family is quite big. Oh, I mean, we have a dragon reserve, Draco said. I can contact Charlie. He works at a dragon reserve. Ron also spoke at the same time. Draco, I can't miss gaining a dragon like this. Ron, Neville, Harry, and Hermione, we can't let him get the dragon like this. The tension between the two was palpable. An invisible sense of hostility filled the air. Hagrid noticed the strange atmosphere and was about to look at Kasenhis, but the latter preemptively glanced at his wristwatch. All right, kids, it's curfew time already. If you don't want Filch to catch you, it's time to leave. I'll escort you back, Kasenhis said. The tension broke as the 5 students each let out a huff, stood up, and prepared to leave. After leaving Hagrid's hut, Kasenhis conjured 3 luminous orbs to float around him and guided the 5 students back to the castle. Should I just get a glass of milk and sleep, or should I get a hot chocolate and read a bit? Kasenhis was walking ahead while mumbling to himself, while the little wizards followed him from the back while whispering among themselves. They were nearing the entrance to the Slytherin common room when a sudden commotion erupted behind Kasen, who was walking in the front. How could you? Ron shouted suddenly. Neville and Ron had already drawn their wands, prepared to hex Draco and risk losing house points, while Harry and Hermione were caught in confusion, clearly unsure of what had just happened. As for Kasenhis, who was occupied with his own thoughts, had no idea what was going on either. Neville noticed Kasenhis's puzzled expression and quickly explained, Malfoy, he called Hermione a mudblood. Chapter 47 Detention. Kasenhis remained silent, an oppressive stillness settling over the hallway. Draco, for some reason, felt an eerie pressure weighing down on him and swallowed nervously. What does mudblood mean? Harry and Hermione exchanged glances. Although both of them knew it wasn't something pleasant, they didn't understand the wizarding slang. In short, it's a really nasty term aimed at Muggle-born wizards, Ron explained. This explanation not only clarified things for Harry and Hermione but also helped Kasenhis understand. It sounded like a mix of personal insult and bloodline discrimination. This was beyond him. Even though he now knew the term wasn't just some casual insult, he still didn't grasp how serious it was. Should he deduct points, give detention, or drag Malfoy outside for humane annihilation? He couldn't gauge the severity and decided he'd better leave it to the older wizards. Though, strictly speaking, neither Snape nor Professor McGonagall were that old. I'm going to summon Professors McGonagall and Snape now. Do any of you have objections? Draco shrank back slightly at the mention of Snape's name but kept quiet, opting for a cold silence toward everyone around him. As for the 4 Gryffindor students, they glared at Draco with fierce eyes but didn't voice any objections either. You all head to my office first. I'll go find Professors McGonagall and Snape, Kasenhis said before vanishing on the spot, leaving behind faint traces of purple light in the air. Hogwarts is supposed to prohibit apparition, isn't it? Draco said, looking baffled as Kasenhis suddenly vanished. Humph, don't ask questions you're not supposed to, Neville said coldly. Before long, a drowsy Professor McGonagall and Snape, who had been brewing potions in his office, were both brought over by Kasenhis. The 3 of them entered the alchemy office, where the 5 young wizards were standing in 2 groups on either side of the coffee table. Now, can someone explain what happened? Snape asked. Your house heads are here now, go ahead and tell them everything, Kasenhis said. Ron was the first to speak, looking directly at Professor McGonagall. We were walking back with Professor Kasenhis from Hagrid's hut, and on the way, Malfoy and Hermione were bickering. Then Malfoy suddenly called Hermione a mudblood. The moment the word mudblood came out of Ron's mouth, Kasenhis felt the temperature in the office drop noticeably. He slowly shuffled over to the fireplace, pressed a skull-shaped button on it, and a roaring fire immediately ignited in the hearth. Before the visibly furious Professor McGonagall could say a word, Snape's sharp gaze locked onto Draco. Draco. Malfoy, is this true? Draco swallowed hard, avoiding Snape's piercing eyes. Seeing Draco's guilty demeanor, Snape understood immediately. Without hesitation, he announced, because of Draco Malfoy, Slytherin will lose 20 points. He also needs a detention to learn his lesson, Professor McGonagall added. I don't have time for that these days. Do you? Snape replied. The 2 exchanged a glance, then suddenly turned toward Kasenhis, who was sitting on the sofa idly fiddling with a quill. I don't really have anything pressing. How long does the detention need to be? Kasenhis asked. A week with additional labor during free periods, Snape said calmly. All right, fine. Let's start tomorrow, Kasenhis nodded. Later, after escorting the last person out of the office, Kasenhis didn't lock the door and head to bed. Instead, he paid a late-night visit to the library. Because of Snape's rather mild punishment, the devaluation of house points across the 4 houses was becoming something of an issue. 20 points lost wasn't particularly impactful anymore. So poor Professor Kasenhis found himself scouring the library in the dead of night for ideas on how to structure Draco's detention. Should it be strict? Or lenient? An hour later, Kasenhis returned to his office and placed a 1 cubic meter block of redstone in the corner. He also retrieved a small file. He had made up his mind. Tomorrow, Draco wouldn't be allowed to leave until he had meticulously ground the entire block of redstone into powder. The next day, in the evening. Professor Kasenhis, are you joking? Draco asked, holding a small file in his hand, barely thicker than his finger. He glanced at the massive redstone block in front of him, clearly heavier than he was, and looked at Kasenhis with a baffled expression. No, Mr. Malfoy. Why else would you be here for detention? You should know that detention isn't supposed to be comfortable. Accepting his fate, Draco crouched down and began filing the block with the tiny tool. Professor, is this really redstone? You know about redstone? You're only a first year. This stuff is famous around the castle. The 5th years go around bragging about it, Draco muttered. Professor, did you use this redstone to create alchemical constructs back then? Yup, and it's powder. It can be used for magical circuits, which work differently from magical sigil circuits. Professor, what's the difference? Kasenhis tapped the desk. You're here for detention, not for a lecture. All right, Draco replied dejectedly, lowering his head. A minute or 2 passed before Kasenhis's voice rang out again. Normally, the magic contained within a sigil circuit operates as magic when processed through the sigils. However, this can be handled by an enchanting table. You're familiar with enchanting tables, aren't you? Yes, I know about them. And the redstone circuit corresponds to the magical circuit, acting like a switch to activate the sigil circuit. Draco nodded. So what's the difference between this and a magical circuit? Faster, stronger, and tougher. Hey, Keep grinding. Sitting at his desk, reading a book, Kasenhis added, please hurry, Mr. Malfoy. Your detention is measured by redstone blocks. If 7 days pass and you've only managed to grind down 1 block, do you know what that means? For some reason, Draco suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. It means you'll still have 6 more redstone blocks of the same size to grind, Kasenhis said without waiting for Draco's response. Oh, dear Professor, you wouldn't be that cruel, right? You wouldn't be that cruel, right? Draco's hands involuntarily moved faster as he filed the redstone block. Chapter 48 almost believed it. Redstone, being soft in texture, didn't produce an ear-piercing sound when filed. With the door closed, it could almost pass as white noise for a night's sleep. And so it went, until the middle of the night when Kasenhis, feeling thirsty, sat up groggily from his bed. He downed a glass of water in one go and, after some thought, stepped out of his bedroom. In the corner of the office, Draco was kneeling and sitting against the wall, holding the file in his hand, completely asleep. Seeing this, Kasenhis returned to his bedroom, retrieved a blanket, and carefully draped it over Draco. Yet, he still had no intention of preparing a bed for Draco or letting him return to his dormitory. After all, people should bear the consequences of their actions. Little Draco had no idea how deeply hurtful his venomous words could be. As his professor, Kasenhis kindly decided to help Draco understand the weight of his actions. And so, the next day, Draco felt the sunlight shining on his face and opened his eyes in a daze. He reflected with great reverence on the nightmare he had endured last night. No blood, no darkness, no sudden jump scares. Just a massive block of redstone and a small file were enough to instill profound fear. But thankfully, the nightmare was over. Instinctively, he tried to stretch his body, only to feel an overwhelming stiffness. He glanced down and saw it redstone. The block he had spent half the night filing was still 2/3 intact. In his hand was the same tiny file. Draco stood up, the blanket draped over him slipping to the ground. Frustrated, he kicked the redstone block in front of him. Oh whoa, ow, ow. Unfortunately, while redstone was soft compared to rock, it was still much harder than Draco's foot. Ah! He instinctively stumbled backward, stepping on the fallen blanket with one foot while the other foot got caught in it. The opposing forces worked against him, and he fell straight backward. The back of his head hit the ground heavily, though luckily, there was a thick wool carpet to cushion the impact. A series of unlucky events, combined with the grievance of spending the entire night grinding redstone, overwhelmed Draco and he broke down crying. Meanwhile, Kasenhis stood outside the office door, holding a stack of invigorating potions. He paused, pressing his ear against the door to listen. Only after the crying inside quieted down did he push the door open and step in. Drink this invigorating potion, otherwise, after spending the night here, you're likely to catch a cold. Kasenhis placed the potion on the coffee table, along with a sandwich and a bottle of pumpkin juice. By the way, that's your breakfast. After grinding redstone all night, Draco was already starving. He picked up the sandwich and took a bite, but as he tried to swallow, his throat ached painfully. He had already caught a cold. Judging by your progress, it'll take about 21 more days to finish and get out of detention, Kasenhis said, glancing at the redstones where and stroking his chin as he sat on the sofa opposite Draco. Looking at the young wizard's mix of fear and resentment in his gaze, Kasenhis shrugged without much concern. It was just like a prisoner hating their jailer, perfectly normal. Still, some explanations were necessary. Do you regret it? What? Draco looked up from his painful attempts to eat, confused. Do you regret using such a filthy term to insult Miss Granger? Draco didn't answer and kept his head down, continuing to eat. This kid. Sigh. Do you even know what mudblood really means? Kasenhis asked. Draco shook his head. That makes sense. Your father might occasionally use such words in your presence, but he certainly wouldn't deliberately teach you their meaning. After all, it's an incredibly vile term. This isn't just a casual slur against Muggle-born wizards. You could combine every insult you can think of: profanities, comparisons to animals, personal attacks, humiliation, curses, and they still wouldn't match the sheer malice carried by the true meaning of this word. I understand, Draco said dryly, his head lowered. Kasenhis wasn't sure if he truly understood or not. Once you finish eating, make sure to drink the invigorating potion. I've prepared 14 bottles for you, but at your current pace, I'll need to get 7 more from Madame Pomfrey. In other words, you'll need to endure this for the next 21 days. Drip drip. Hearing Kasenhis's cold tone, Draco couldn't hold back his tears any longer. The tears he'd fought so hard to suppress broke free again, and the originally sweet sandwich turned salty in under 5 seconds. I hope you remember this lesson, Mr. Malfoy. After eating and taking the potion, you may freshen up here or return to your dormitory, clean up, and then go back to class. After your afternoon classes and completing the labor assigned by Professor McGonagall, return here and continue filing redstone blocks until all 7 are done. Draco listened, trembling, and looked up with a hint of grievance. Can I take a leave of absence and just stay here to finish? If you do that, other young wizards will end up learning far more spells than you. You wouldn't want to find yourself completely defenseless in the next wizard's duel or encounter, would you? Kasenhis didn't outright refuse but calmly laid out the consequences. I'll come back after class, Draco said. Of course. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to go to Severus and personally fetch you, Kasenhis replied. After Draco left the office, Kasenhis waved his hand to gather all the scattered redstone powder in the corners. It was good enough to directly use as teaching materials for 5th years. Soon, the morning classes for 1st years were about over. Draco returned to the alchemy office, looking dejected, and picked up the small file to resume his task. As for Kasenhis, he paid no attention to Draco, calmly sitting on the sofa and brewing a pot of green tea. By the time afternoon classes started, Draco would slink off again, dejected. In this manner, over just half a day, another third of a redstone block had been ground down. Kasenhis was reasonably satisfied with the progress. If Draco maintained this level of efficiency, he might not even need to go back to Madame Pomfrey for another batch of invigorating potions. Of course, the redstone itself was secondary. What Kasenhis truly hoped was that this young wizard, who spoke without thinking, would learn a valuable lesson from this experience. After all, Draco was only 11 years old. A young brat was not yet permanently a young brat. There was still time for change. And so, Professor Kasenhis naively believed that everything was moving in a positive direction. Especially when, a week and a half later, Draco had nearly finished grinding down the final redstone block. If not for the arrival of the 4 Gryffindor students, Kasenhis might have believed it. Truly. Chapter 49. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Wait, repeat that for me again. Kasenhis took a deep breath and spoke slowly. So, Draco was in my office first, obediently grinding the redstone, correct? In the corner, a teary-eyed Draco and the 4 Gryffindor students all nodded simultaneously. Then, the 4 of you came looking for me, found my office door conveniently unlocked, and Draco just happened to say come in, so you entered. The 5 young wizards nodded again. After you came in, Draco was still diligently grinding the redstone. Ron, you sat there drinking cola. Where did you even get cola? Never mind, not the point right now. Anyway, Draco didn't provoke you, and you, Ron, sat on the sofa drinking cola and running your mouth. In the end, you finally managed to make Draco angry, wands were drawn, and a duel broke out. The 5 nodded once more. Kasenhis nodded in understanding. I see, so, if that's the case, why didn't you just go outside to fight? As you said, my office door was unlocked. After fighting, you wouldn't have had any trouble coming back in. We were afraid of being caught by a professor or Filch if we fought outside, Harry said in a small voice. Harry, let me ask you something. Who am I? Kasenhis slumped into the one remaining intact sofa in the corner, pressing his thumb against the bridge of his nose, too drained to summon any energy or authority. Your name is Kasenhis and you are the alchemy professor, Harry blurted out without thinking, giving the first answer that came to mind. Then he realized Professor Kasen, the last word was indeed professor. Exactly, I am also a professor. I completely understand your fear of professors, which is why you wouldn't dare to cause trouble under their watchful eyes. But can you please remember I'm also a professor? Can someone explain to me why? Why do you treat my office like this and my redstone flash? I painstakingly carved it bit by bit with my own hands. Kasen tapped the coffee table in front of him, where a broken-in-half figure of the flash lay in 2 pieces. I'm talking to you, kids. Why are you afraid of other professors but not me? Gryffindors were never known for thinking before speaking. Ron, almost as if possessed, blurted out, because you're a good person. Ridiculous. So a good person's office deserves to be turned upside down by your wand-waving antics. We are very sorry. To be fair, this was the first time Kasen had genuinely lost his composure as a professor. It wasn't because of the office itself, it had been blown up more than once, and every time he redecorated it in a new style. But this time... Sigh. Kasen lightly tapped his knuckles on the coffee table, and the two halves of the flash figurine instantly crumbled to powder. All right, my 5 supremely talented young wizards, I'll just say this, I need to start planning the renovation of my new office. So I'm sending you all to Professor McGonagall. And Draco, you're lucky. While this isn't your fault this time, one thing doesn't cancel out another. That redstone block of yours is still on the ledger. Now, your choice, do you wait for me to finish redecorating my office and return to continue grinding, or would you prefer to let Professor McGonagall's punishment substitute for the redstone block? Kasen asked. Professor McGonagall. Draco declared firmly without hesitation. All right, then, follow me. The 5 young wizards trailed behind Kasenhis, shuffling dejectedly as they made their way to Professor McGonagall's office. There, the 5 of them witnessed the transformation of a dignified and venerable professor into a roaring lion. Once the reporting was finished, Kasenhis trusted that Professor McGonagall would handle things fairly. Feeling no need to stick around, he promptly left her office. On the way, while Dumbledore was busy sneaking snacks in the kitchen, Kasenhis slipped into the headmaster's office unnoticed. Then he discovered that the wine that was supposed to belong to Professor Kasen had Dumbledore's name written on it. How could such a thing be allowed? Pretending to look at the bottle in his arm, Kasenhis stuffed the bottle into his robe. Oh, you will feel lonely if I leave you, right? Kasen looked at the second bottle and also pocketed that and headed toward Hagrid's hut. There, he witnessed the third dramatic event of the day. Hagrid's newly hatched dragon, now roughly the size of a table, was intently studying how to swallow the magma blocks at the base of the fireplace. This little one, big one. Hagrid, is Fluffy supposed to grow this fast? Kasenhis asked, raising an eyebrow. Hagrid raised his own eyebrows. She's not called Fluffy. Fluffy is that 3-headed dog. Oh, Fang. Fang is the dog chewing on a bone. All right, maybe my memory isn't great. What's your plan for her? By the looks of it, in a few days, she'll be sizing you up for dinner. Don't say that she's a good girl, but she's definitely getting too big. You're right. Actually, Ron and Malfoy gave me 2 business cards for dragon reserves. I've been researching them recently to see which one has better conditions. Hagrid pulled out a thick stack of documents. Truly, Kasenhis had never seen so much paper within a 5-meter radius of Hagrid before. Pick whichever you like. Also, I don't want to hear those 2 troublemakers' names right now. My figurine was destroyed because of them. As Kasenhis spoke, he pulled the bottle of wine from his robe. Wow! Isn't that the wine Dumbledore brought back from France last time? That's some fine stuff. Hagrid exclaimed in surprise. What do you mean, Dumbledore's? As of 45 minutes ago, it's part of your one and only Kasenhis's collection. Ha ha ha. His students gave me a lot of trouble after all. Hermione went to Dumbledore's office. Hagrid asked, stroking his beard. Kasenhis looked at Hagrid strangely, but comforted him, don't worry. If you don't say anything and I don't say anything, who will know? Besides, he doesn't have any evidence. But I remember Dumbledore cherishing those 2 bottles of wine very much. I heard he even tells them bedtime stories, Hagrid said, swallowing hard. Humph. Kasenhis cheerfully opened the bottle, pouring the wine into 2 glasses. Hagrid hesitantly accepted one. Good wine. Right. But Dumbledore. Don't worry about Dumbledore. So many people know the password to his office, and he has no idea it was me who took it, Kasenhis said, waving dismissively before taking another sip of wine. Hagrid took a deep breath and followed suit with a big gulp. Later that night, Kasenhis, now quite tipsy, pushed open the door to Hagrid's hut. The cold winter wind, carrying snowflakes, didn't sober him up. If anything, it made him want to collapse face first into the snow. Oh, by the way, did you know the 2 statues guarding Dumbledore's office have self-awareness? Kasenhis instantly sobered up. The alcohol evaporating off him made it look like steam was rising from his body. Why didn't you say so earlier? Hagrid fidgeted, twisting his thick fingers together. He couldn't exactly admit that he'd been eyeing Dumbledore's fine wine for a long time, could he? Chapter 50 It's from the Hogshead Inn. Gulp, gulp, gulp. Gulp, gulp, gulp. Kasenhis had stopped by the Hogshead and asked the bearded bartender to pour some whiskey into a bottle, any whiskey. As for what kind? It didn't matter. As long as it wouldn't give Dumbledore diarrhea, it was good enough. This time, Kasenhis didn't use the password to walk into the headmaster's office directly. Instead, he used an Ender-style teleportation to land beneath the windowsill of the office. Grabbing onto the windowsill with both hands, he pulled himself up for a quick look to confirm whether Dumbledore was inside. After all, teleporting straight into the office only to find Dumbledore sitting there would be terribly awkward. Luckily, a quick peek through the window showed no one inside. Perfect. With a push, Kasenhis opened the office window from the outside, clumsily climbed in, and pulled 2 bottles of whiskey from behind his belt. He carefully placed them on Dumbledore's desk, ensuring they were perfectly aligned as if he were about to measure them with a ruler. As for whether the swapped bottles would raise suspicion, Hagrid had said that Dumbledore was so attached to these bottles he wouldn't even drink them, so it should be fine. Stretching his back, Kasenhis prepared to teleport away. Just as he was about to leave, his gaze landed on a cabinet in the corner of the office. Inside the cabinet, was half a person. More specifically, the lower half of a person. Or rather, Dumbledore had stuck his upper body into the cabinet. The person inside the cabinet had noticed Kasenhis the moment he opened the window. A muffled voice came from inside, "Oh? I hear some energetic noises. Which young wizard is it? Hurry and give me a hand, I'm stuck in the cabinet." Hearing Dumbledore's words, Kasenhis exhaled in relief. As long as the headmaster didn't recognize him, that was fine. He had no intention of helping Dumbledore out of his predicament. After all, Dumbledore was immensely powerful, and this cabinet wasn't some kind of mimicking monster. If he wanted to get out, all it would take was a thought, no wand necessary. At this moment, the most important thing is to run away quickly, but it's a pity that I can't teleport. It's best if he thinks it's someone else and not me. Kasenhis quickly climbed back onto the windowsill, crouching half-kneeling on top. In his hand appeared a water source block, as though he was preparing to leave here with a dramatic splash effect. But then, Dumbledore's muffled voice came again from inside the cabinet. "Don't be in such a rush, Kasenhis. Who else but you would sneak into the headmaster's office to pilfer the poor headmaster's collection?" The mental pep talk Kasenhis had been giving himself crumbled in an instant. His expression changed completely. "Ah! Ahaha! Haha, headmaster, is that you? How did you get stuck in the cabinet?" With lightning speed, Kasenhis jumped off the windowsill and grabbed Dumbledore with the strength of someone uprooting a tree. Hugging him tightly, Kasenhis yanked him out of the cabinet with all his might. It was as if his frantic effort to free Dumbledore from the cabinet would somehow erase the evidence of him sneaking in to steal the wine. Of course, in reality, as Kasenhis pulled, he was also meticulously controlling small magical cubes to carefully separate the stuck parts of the cabinet and Dumbledore. After all, Dumbledore was over 100 years old, he couldn't actually risk pulling him to death. Soon enough, like 2 tightly stuck plastic chairs suddenly being yanked apart, there was a faint pop as Dumbledore was freed and emerged back into the world. "Ah, thank you, Kasen," Dumbledore said. Kasenhis sat gloomily in a chair. "That said, I'm still curious, how did you know it was me here and not some mischievous young wizard flying around on a broomstick? First, the 2 fellows at the door told me that you came here earlier and took my 2 bottles of wine. Second, Kasen, you underestimate your boldness. While young wizards can certainly be daring, sneaking into the headmaster's office is still a bit beyond their capabilities. Okay, ahem, in that case, since you're no longer stuck, I should probably leave. You know, Professor McGonagall is rushing me to finish my lesson plans," Kasenhis said after listening to the explanation. With exaggerated slowness, he rose from his chair and inched toward the office door, as if hoping Dumbledore would forget he was there. It was almost as if Kasenhis thought Dumbledore were a frog capable of seeing moving objects but blind to anything stationary. "Kasen, do you really think I'm so senile in your mind?" Dumbledore asked, sitting in his chair with arms crossed, quietly watching Kasenhis's performance. His voice came just as Kasenhis was about to slip out the door. "Oh, all right, is there something I can do for you?" Kasenhis turned back, sat down in the chair opposite Dumbledore, and asked in one breath. "Thank you for choosing not to teleport away immediately. Oh, can I still do that now? Apologies, it's too late for that. Alright, what's the matter then? Dumbledore sighed slightly, picking up the 2 bottles of wine on his desk and walking toward the cabinet in the corner. Time and patience make wine richer and more full-bodied. You could start stocking a few bottles yourself. Even ordinary wine will mature into something extraordinary with enough time. Kasenhis nodded. I'll keep that in mind. By the way, where did you refill these 2 bottles? The hogshead. Dumbledore paused mid-motion as he was about to place the bottles in the cabinet. After a moment's consideration, he changed course entirely and tossed both bottles straight into the trash bin. Is there something wrong with the wine there? I thought it tasted pretty good earlier, Kasenhis said, his mouth twitching. Nothing much. If you're happy drinking it, keep going there. You probably have something you want me to do, right? No, absolutely not. Why would I have anything for you to do? Do I look like the type of person who only acts when there's something to gain, someone who demands compensation for every little thing? Dumbledore shrugged as he spoke. Then why did you stop me from leaving? Because your attempt to sneak away like I'm a frog that can only see moving objects was far too amusing. I couldn't resist. All right, Kasen, you can go now. Kasenhis rolled his eyes, got up, and started to leave. Oh, by the way, Kasen, is Hagrid drunk? Dumbledore asked. Yes, why? And you? You scared the alcohol fumes right out of me, but at least I'm still sober, Kasenhis replied, turning back and spreading his hands. In that case, as Hagrid's loyal drinking companion, perhaps you could take over his responsibilities for tonight, Dumbledore suggested. Inspecting the Forbidden Forest? Always wanted to do that. At 10 o'clock tonight you still have 2 hours to repair yourself. Dumbledore glanced at a small clock placed in the corner of the table and said. Kasen nodded and left the headmaster's office without incident. After drinking such good wine, it was fair to go on a present walk, patrolling the Forbidden Forest for one night. Chapter 51, Forbidden Forest. 10 p.m. Shall I get going for my night patrol then? Professor Kasen. Harry shouted. May I ask why you're all here? And Filch, what's going on? Kasenhis looked at the group of young wizards, then at Filch, who had escorted them over. Good evening, Professor. This is a punishment assigned by Professor McGonagall for their reckless night strolls. Originally, they were supposed to patrol the Forbidden Forest with Hagrid, but now it's been changed to you, Filch replied humbly. What? For being reckless, strolling at night. She gave them punishment to stroll the Forbidden Forest, at night? Not to mention they were gonna go with Hagrid. Are you sure McGonagall assigned that punishment? Kasen looked at Filch with some doubt. Yes, Professor. Filch looked very happy for some reason. All right. Thank you, Mr. Filch. And you lot, stick close to me, don't fall behind. Since you're here, we'll just patrol the outskirts of the Forbidden Forest and call it a night. After Filch left, Kasenhis conjured a small lantern in his hand. At the same time, 3 glowing orbs of fluorite appeared, orbiting around him. Cool. Of course. If this weren't during your punishment time, I might even let you touch them. Draco, would you kindly remove your hand? Kasenhis had barely finished saying he might allow them to touch the fluorite when Draco immediately reached out and placed his hand on one. In short, it was very disrespectful. Holding his wand in one hand and surrounded by the floating fluorite, Kasenhis ensured the orbs could instantly transform into hard obsidian to knock out any magical creature that dared to launch a surprise attack, quite literally. He even brought out a rope, instructing the young wizards to each hold onto a section to ensure no one fell behind. As the most reckless and self-preserving, Draco was quick to grab the very front of the rope. After all, being closest to Professor Kasenhis felt much safer than holding a useless piece of rope. The other 4 students, however, hesitated awkwardly. On the one hand, they also wanted to stay as close to Kasenhis as possible. On the other hand, as Gryffindors, their ingrained courage made them reluctant to compete with Draco for the most forward position. And so, the group of 6 formed a shivering little squad, slowly patrolling the outskirts of the Forbidden Forest. Professor, will we encounter any danger? Harry, walking at the back of the group, suddenly asked. Probably not. This punishment was arranged by Professor McGonagall, right? While Dumbledore can be unreliable at times, Professor McGonagall is someone you can trust to be thorough and responsible, Kasenhis explained. Draco, walking just behind him, let out a sigh of relief. McGonagall didn't seem like the kind of person who would recklessly endanger the lives of young wizards. After all, someone that serious. All right, let's finish this patrol quickly. Once you're done with tonight's punishment, you can happily curl up in your warm beds and no longer have to grind redstone. Although, Kasenhis added, that might not be entirely true. Draco, just make sure you don't repeat the same mistake you made before. Draco shuddered at the memory of the nightmare-like redstone grinding punishment. Never again, Professor. The group continued chatting sporadically, mostly Kasenhis trying to keep the young wizards distracted from their fear by finding topics to talk about. He hoped it would help them relax a little. The magical creatures in the Forbidden Forest were mostly intelligent, albeit not highly so. Still, they were clever enough to distinguish between a group of young wizards and a highly powerful adult wizard. Such a combination was not likely to be seen as prey. The simple-minded magical creatures could easily compute such basic calculations. Taking a gamble in this case was almost guaranteed to end badly. When Kasenhis finally felt they had walked far enough, he pulled out a pocket watch from his coat. It's already midnight. We'll need another 2 hours to make it out of the forest. I hope none of you have classes tomorrow morning. Actually, we do. An 8 a.m. class, Harry said with a miserable expression. Perhaps you could ask Madame Pomfrey for some invigorating potions. They're perfect for groggy mornings if you don't mind the embarrassment of having white smoke coming out of your ears, Kasenhis replied. Maybe, Neville muttered softly. Then he raised his head, peering past Ron, Hermione, and Draco, finally looking toward Professor Kasenhis. At that moment, Kasenhis was tilting his head back, controlling the floating fluorite orbs to move toward a particular area. There seemed to be a figure. The figure, realizing it had been spotted, stepped out from the bushes. It was a muscular being with the upper body of a human and the lower body of a horse, a centaur. I am a professor at Hogwarts, Kasenhis. And you are. Kasenhis's hand remained tightly wrapped around his wand. He was prepared if this centaur made even the slightest hostile move, 3 wither skulls would immediately reduce it to fragments. I am Ronan, a centaur. We have always lived deep within the Forbidden Forest, keeping to ourselves and avoiding conflict with wizards, the centaur replied calmly. Kasenhis nodded. That's for the best. So, Mr. Ronan, why are you here instead of staying in the depths of the forest? If I'm not mistaken, this area is considered the outer ring, maybe bordering on the middle. Tonight, Mars shines unusually bright. Correspondingly, this signifies that the Forbidden Forest will not be peaceful in the near future, Ronan said. Mars, disaster and misfortune? Kasenhis asked. Ronan nodded. The centaur's astrology differs from the wizard's divination, but our interpretation of Mars is similar. Recently, there have been numerous unicorn deaths in the forest. It could be the work of some powerful and malevolent magical creature, or perhaps individuals with sinister motives. Kasenhis nodded, his eyes fixed intently on the centaur in front of him, though his tone remained light as he joked with the 5 young wizards behind him. What a shame! If we'd heard this an hour earlier, we could have been back in the castle by now. Still, it's not too late. Thank you for the warning, Mr. Ronan, Kasenhis said as he began to slowly retreat, shielding the young wizards behind him. Ronan seemed to understand. The centaurs have no intention of attacking you. Kasenhis replied, keeping his wand raised until Ronan turned and began to trot away. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, and only when the centaur was completely out of sight did Kasenhis lower his wand. Let's get moving as well. I don't know if what that centaur said is true, but I'm not taking any chances. This time, the group of 6 people did not follow the original route, but directly followed the Big Dipper in the sky, heading straight towards the Hogwarts castle. Along the way, they encountered rivers, bridges, and slopes. Everything was going fine until this moment. Fuck. Kasen took a deep breath. He regretted it, really regretted it. If he had known that such an unfortunate thing would happen, there would be no straight line and he would have just followed the determined route. Chapter 52 Kasenhis vs Unicorn Killer. Preface: this chapter includes enchantment attributes, curse of vanishing/disappearance, and magic modification, falling under secondary creation. _ A figure clad in a black robe, their face obscured, was kneeling on the ground. In front of them lay a gravely injured unicorn, its silver blood flowing from its neck. The black-robed figure was hunched over, licking the blood away, mouthful by mouthful. Initially, the two sides weren't supposed to cross paths, one group following the planned route, merely patrolling, while the other had deliberately chosen this desolate spot. Both unaware parties were silently agreeing to avoid unnecessary complications. Well, fate is a bitch. Everything was going fine, until Kasenhis, in a moment of sheer misfortune, decided to take a shortcut. And so, they stumbled into each other. The black-robed figure turned their head, noticing Kasenhis and the young wizards. "Scatter and find cover," Kasenhis ordered without hesitation. This was no time to delay. Unlike Ronan, who was a natural resident of the Forbidden Forest with no malicious intent, the individual before them was a stark contrast. This figure, sneaking into the Forbidden Forest in the dead of night to slay a unicorn and drink its blood, was undeniably a dark wizard. And a dark wizard had to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. 3 wither skulls, radiating decay and death, shrieked through the air as they hurtled toward the black-robed figure. The figure raised its wand, deflecting one of the skulls with lightning speed, but as the other 2 bore down on them, it had no choice but to roll to the side in a hasty attempt to evade. One wither skull struck the ground with a deafening explosion, while the other, deflected, collided with a towering tree, detonating on impact. Boom! At the sites of the 2 explosions, a visible wither effect rapidly spread. The soil turned black and crumbled, while the unfortunate tree was instantly reduced to a charcoal-like structure. Oh, the renowned Professor Kasenhis of Hogwarts, stooping to use dark magic. The black-robed figure rasped. "If it's to kill a dark wizard like you, I only regret not knowing the killing curse," Kasenhis retorted sharply. In the corner of the battlefield, the 4 Gryffindor students peeked nervously. This wasn't the usual gentle Kasenhis they knew. His eyes, colder than Snape's when grading Neville's troll-like essays, were terrifying beyond words. The warm, sunny Professor Kasenhis was gone, replaced by a bitter northern wind, bent on annihilating the dark wizard before him. Avada Kedavra! A sickly green light shot from the black-robed figure's wand. Kasenhis raised his hand, conjuring an obsidian wall that absorbed the killing curse. With a wave of his hand, the wall shattered into countless razor-sharp obsidian shards, which flew toward the black-robed figure like a deadly storm. Fiend fire! A roaring blood-red fire erupted, consuming the incoming obsidian fragments entirely. Kasenhis snorted coldly and flicked his wand again, sending several ender crystals hurtling toward the figure obscured behind the flames. The explosion of the crystals unleashed a massive shockwave that rippled through the fiend fire, causing it to tremble violently. Yet the figure remained standing, their body glowing with an eerie light. Despite the force of the blast, it stubbornly refused to fall. "Stay here and die." The black-robed figure pulled a shattered glass cup from their pocket. It shimmered with spatial ripples. It was a portkayat. The moment the figure activated the portkayat, they vanished abruptly. The wall of fire in front of Kasenhis, now untethered from its master, began to spread and consume everything in its path. "Professor! Can you use the spell you used during the dueling demonstration?" Hermione peeked out from her hiding spot and shouted. "This fire is vast and untamed. That spell won't work this time." Kasenhis replied quickly, pulling out parchment and a quill. The quill tip flew across the parchment, sketching an intricate array of symbols. Finally, he summoned an enchanting table. "If I catch that guy, I swear he'll regret it." Kasenhis growled as he placed the parchment onto the floating book atop the enchanting table. The book flipped its pages rapidly, and a surge of majestic purple magic enveloped the all-consuming fiend fire. Curse of Vanishing. Buzz. As the magical book snapped shut in Kasenhis's hands, the fiend fire, which had been devouring everything moments ago, vanished into thin air. If it weren't for the scorched land and the forest reduced to ash and charcoal, the young wizards might have thought it had all been a nightmare. Boom! A burst of gold and crimson light flared nearby. Kasenhis, trembling slightly, gripped his wand tightly and turned bloodshot eyes toward the figures emerging from the flames. Dumbledore, Professor McGonagall, Snape, and Flitwick. Kasen. Professor. Harry and Neville, who had been keeping a close eye on Kasenhis, quickly climbed over their cover to catch him before he could collapse face first to the ground. Dumbledore approached swiftly, his expression a mix of fear and barely concealed anger. Yet he forced himself to remain calm, striding forward. "It's just exhaustion from overextending his self-protection." Severus. Snape immediately pulled 2 bottles of magic restoring potion from his robes. With practiced efficiency, he shoved Harry and Neville aside as if moving useless objects, opened one of the potion bottles, and began pouring it into Kasenhis's mouth. He even tilted Kasenhis's chin to prevent choking. That damned dark wizard, how dare he, how could he? Professor McGonagall's eyes were red with fury as she surveyed the devastated battlefield and the unconscious Kasenhis lying on the ground. She couldn't bear to think about what might have happened if Kasenhis hadn't been here. If Hagrid had been the one to lead these young wizards on patrol tonight. A wave of suffocating guilt washed over her. She had only wanted to teach the 5 misbehaving students a stern lesson, but instead. Meanwhile, Professors Flitwick and Sprout were scanning the area with their wands, ensuring that no lingering embers from the fiend fire remained. Any overlooked sparks could spell disaster. Headmaster Dumbledore, Professor Kasenhis, is he? The other 3 young wizards ran over, looking at Dumbledore anxiously. In this matter, Severus is the expert, Dumbledore replied. Probably, his magic reserves are depleted, but they can be restored. 2 bottles of potion should do the trick. However, his mental exhaustion he won't be fit to teach for at least a week, Snape said with a furrowed brow. Dumbledore nodded. That's already the best outcome we could hope for. Let's get him back to his office. Not sending him to the hospital wing. Oh. Harry started to speak instinctively but quickly stopped himself, realizing that the hospital wing also housed Professor Quirrell, the dark wizard who didn't get along with Professor Kasenhis. In Kasenhis's current state, sending him there would be like serving him up on a platter to Quirrell. Going to his own office was undoubtedly the better choice, so Harry quickly held his tongue. Dumbledore glanced at Harry, nodded in agreement, and said, Severus, I'll need you to brew some potions. With that, he gathered everyone together. In a flash of flames, they reappeared in the alchemy office. After dismissing the others, the office was left with only Dumbledore, Snape, and the unconscious Kasenhis lying on the bed. Now, it was Dumbledore's turn to leave. Where are you going? Snape asked. To find my old alchemy textbooks from my school days. It seems I'll need to step in as the alchemy substitute professor for the week. I don't think that's necessary. The previously unconscious Kasenhis suddenly struggled to sit up in bed. Chapter 53 The care is killing me. Actually, I can handle this myself. Handle what? Maybe an orange. Hermione sat on a small stool, quickly peeling an orange. She broke off a segment and held it up to Kasenhis, who was lying on the bed. With an air of reluctant dignity, he opened his mouth and ate it. The office and the bedroom were connected, and the door was left open. This allowed Kasenhis to have a clear view of what the other young wizards were doing. For instance, Harry, holding a wand in his left hand and a cloth in his right, was diligently cleaning the office with a blend of magic and manual labor. Neville, on the other hand, was busy washing the endless stream of fruits being brought in. Washing apples and pears made sense, but Neville was also scrubbing oranges and bananas fruits with peels. When asked why, Neville explained that he was afraid that unwashed fruit skins might contaminate the clean ones. Yes, a very conscientious child, very conscientious indeed. Meanwhile, Ron was outside the office door, moving basket after basket of fruit into the room. He carefully noted down the names and cards attached to each fruit basket before stacking them neatly on the desk. In a corner, a small blonde wizard was heating a potion bottle in a water bath. Using a mercury thermometer, he meticulously tried to maintain the temperature at exactly 37.5 degrees Celsius. Honestly, I'm not even injured. There's no need to go this far, Kasenhis said dryly, lying stiffly on the bed under the binding effects of what he could only describe as a stern gaze spell. Professor Snape said. I suspect Severus is retaliating for the Christmas gift I gave him, though I can tell he's actually using it. Have you noticed his hair lately? Hermione nodded knowingly. I did notice that since coming back from the Christmas holiday, Professor Snape's hair has looked much better. Exactly, that's my masterpiece. Would you like to learn? I can teach you one-on-one, just you. None of the other students would get this treatment, Kasenhis said, sounding like the big bad wolf lying in Grandma's bed, his tone full of temptation. Well, as tempting as that offer is, I must decline, Hermione said with some difficulty. Oh, aren't you supposed to be in class? Don't tell me you skipped lessons just to look after me. Let me make it clear, I won't appreciate any behavior that involves skipping class. Our next class is in half an hour. Then go. Believe me, I'll be just fine here by myself. There's no chance I'll try to get out of bed, trip over my slippers, get thrown over my shoulder, smack my head on the floor, and end up face to face with death himself, Kasenhis said, his face lighting up with exaggerated confidence. "Our dorm mates are bringing our books for us, so no need to worry about that, Professor. But surely you should be heading to the classroom, right?" "Yes, but that will be in 20 minutes. Okay." Though those 20 minutes felt excruciatingly long, they did bring Kasenhis a small measure of comfort. Just 20 minutes. Only 20 minutes. Kasenhis stared blankly at the ceiling. When he had counted up to 15 minutes and 26 seconds, Draco quickly moved across the room, carrying a potion precisely heated to 38.9 degrees Celsius. This temperature was the result of Draco's meticulous calculations. Taking into account the heat conduction of the glass bottle, the specific heat capacity of the liquid, and his walking speed, the potion would reach a perfect 37.5 degrees Celsius by the time he arrived. "Just leave it here. You can go," Kasenhis said. Draco's face fell immediately, but surprisingly, he didn't respond with his usual snide remarks. He simply placed the potion on the bedside table and left without a word. "I really must thank Severus and the entire 18-person radius of his family tree. Though he's responsible for putting me in this pitiful state of being watched by you all, his potion-making skills are... Wait, what's that garlic smell? Did he chop up Quirrell and mix him in?" After much pleading and bargaining, Kasenhis finally convinced Hermione to let him sit up slightly and extend an arm out from under the covers to drink the potion himself. But the moment the potion touched his tongue, its bizarre flavor contorted his face into an expression of pure agony. "This morning's potion tasted like orange soda," Kasenhis muttered, lying back on the bed in despair. He felt as though the sweat from his body had already etched a human-shaped outline into the sheets, while the blanket continued to smother him tightly. To drink a potion warmer than room temperature under these conditions, it made him feel like he didn't need to live this long after all. Truly. But as time passed, Kasenhis grew increasingly doubtful. There was no way Hermione and her little group of first-year brats could come up with a spell capable of forcing him to stay obediently in bed. Not even Dumbledore could keep him under the covers. How could they? Impossible. Finally, in Kasenhis's perception of time, 20 minutes crawled to completion. However, Hermione and the others didn't leave. Instead, they opened the office door, and a line of people began orderly filing into the room. "What's going on?" Kasenhis asked, frowning. Hermione clasped her hands behind her back and said sternly, "To ensure that you stay in bed and recover properly, we've invited some reinforcements." "What?" The first young witch entered. It was Angelina from Gryffindor's third year. Now, this was a problem. This kid was way too diligent. The same person who sent him a pair of thick gloves for Christmas, along with a reminder to wear warm clothes in the winter? If she stayed, she'd probably insist on piling 2 or 3 extra blankets on him for his health. For his own safety, Kasenhis shook his head furiously, a look of terror on his face. Seeing this, Angelina looked a bit disappointed but turned and left. The next person to enter was a Hufflepuff student, Cedric Diggory, a third-year but handpicked by Kasenhis as the fourth-year alchemy class representative. Now, this one was a solid choice. He was upright, adaptable, and most importantly, physically strong enough to understand Kasenhis's current predicament of feeling like a furnace. Cedric's presence offered a glimmer of hope. Of course, none of that was true. Kasenhis had another reason for wanting Cedric to stay. He was the type of kid you could reason with. Maybe, just maybe, with the right words, Kasenhis could convince him to sneakily let him stretch his legs or get some fresh air. Kasenhis managed a relieved smile. "Cedric, you stay." "Yes, just you. The rest of them can go. They've got better things to do. Take a walk outside or get some rest in bed. Anything's better than hanging around here." Cedric nodded and stood quietly in the corner of the bedroom. But Hermione simply waved the next person in. What's going on?" Kasenhis asked, thoroughly baffled. "Professor, given your personality, do you really think one person is enough?" Chapter 54 Paddle Sisters and the Weasley Twins. "Enough, it's really enough." Kasenhis looked on in despair as one young student after another walked into the office. He scanned each of them, recalling their personalities and habits. Inviting them in wasn't just bringing wolves into the house, it was like throwing himself into a fiery pit. For instance, there was Tracy, a third year who had been bubbling with pink hearts and admiration from the very first class. She was definitely a no-go. Then there was Cassidy, a seventh-year witch who, as Kasenhis clearly remembered, had an afternoon class today. He quickly shooed her away, sending her back to attend her lesson like a proper student. And so it went, as Kasenhis watched one young wizard and witch after another come in and then leave, until a pair of twins walked in. The Paddle sisters. One was in Gryffindor, and the other in Ravenclaw. Both were first years. Even Hermione was a bit taken aback. She had overheard earlier that Parvati had requested leave from her afternoon class and had assumed it was for something important. Turns out, it was for this. Kasenhis examined the twins curiously. He vividly remembered that whenever these two appeared together, they were always holding hands. While this habit of theirs tended to draw ire, especially on the staircases, the pattern was unmistakable. If they were in the same space and standing, they were always hand in hand. It wasn't his fault he knew them so well. Back before he had mastered Ender-style teleportation, the twins' tardiness to several of his classes had left quite the impression. This time, however, the Paddle sisters behaved differently. One kept her hands behind her back, while the other instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, though she seemed to realize it wasn't very ladylike and slowly lowered them. Still, they couldn't quite conceal their distinctive demeanor. Something is definitely wrong with them. All right, it's decided. Cedric and the Paddle sisters, it'll just be the three of them. Kasenhis declared. Fine. 3 should be enough, Hermione said, though she'd considered bringing in a couple more. After some thought, she nodded and went outside to dismiss the remaining students still waiting in line. Gathering her books, she and Harry's group hurried off toward the classroom. The office was now quiet, leaving only the 4 of them. Kasenhis stretched lazily, relaxing a bit. Suddenly, 2 bottles of milk appeared in his hands. Neat, ain't it? He couldn't even remember when this ability had been unlocked. Lately, it seemed like every time he woke up, a new block or item became accessible. The milk source block was just one of many. The potion must have been bitter. Here, drink this. Kasenhis tossed the bottles to the Paddle sisters, who caught them effortlessly. After exchanging a glance, they drank the milk in one gulp. Cedric, however, looked utterly dumbfounded. You really went all out to get here. Kasenhis nodded in agreement, eyeing the Weasley twins, who had now reverted to their original forms. How did you manage to convince the Paddle sisters to give you their hair? I remember them being very particular about it. There's no way they'd just cut it off and hand it over to anyone. The twins, changing out of their disguises, exchanged a glance and shrugged. That's not important. What's important is this milk of yours, it's amazing. And, most importantly, we're here to rescue you from the dire straits you are currently in. Truly, I must say Harry and the others are treating you like a fire salamander. No, no, no. Even a fire salamander couldn't handle this kind of heat, Kasenhis said, feeling uncomfortable as he threw off the blanket. Enough already. You're not the Paddle sisters anymore. Doesn't using that formal tone feel awkward? Hee, it does. Yeah, Professor McGonagall always says it's a tone. Right, a tone called politeness. In the corner, Cedric still seemed stunned by the Weasley twins' audacity. All right, enough joking. You still haven't answered my question. Where did you get the Paddle sisters' hair? Did you sell yourselves for it? Kasenhis, now in his pajamas, leaned back comfortably on a small sofa in the bedroom and asked. The twins exchanged a glance. I sincerely hope you really did sell yourselves, and it wasn't some bizarre potion or, worse, knocking them out and snipping it off, Kasenhis said, narrowing his eyes. The twins remained silent. Where are they? 3rd floor corridor, end of the hall, in an empty classroom, Professor, one of the twins answered. Don't worry, they're perfectly safe, the other added. Kasenhis stood up stiffly, putting on his clothes. We'll settle this later. You'd better pray to Merlin that they're just taking a nap. No, actually, I should be the one praying. Soon after, Hogwarts students witnessed an unusual sight. Kasenhis, who was supposed to be recuperating in his office, striding purposefully through the castle. Behind him trailed Cedric and the Weasley twins. Kasenhis, clearly in a hurry, was dressed in a trench coat over his pajamas, with Tom and Jerry slippers on his feet. Merlin's beard. Hermione's going to lose her mind when she sees this, a Gryffindor student whispered to their friend while slacking off in the hallway. Should we tell her? We're doing this for Professor Kasenhis's health. Yes, that's it. Definitely not some pointless prank, the student declared, pulling out a Remembrall-like recording sphere. Infusing it with magic, they captured the scene in full detail. When the four arrived at the classroom, they found the Paddle sisters diligently practicing magic inside. One sister attacked while the other defended, then they swapped roles, taking turns in what looked like a turn-based duel. Professor Kasenhis? What are you doing out here? And why are you dressed like that? Parvati Paddle asked curiously. Care to explain? Kasenhis turned his icy gaze toward the Weasley twins. We told you, they're perfectly safe here, one of the Weasley twins began. Unless, of course, they injure themselves while practicing magic, added the other. And everything else you've been imagining is entirely in your head. Really, you can't blame us for this, they chimed in unison. The twins' seamless banter left Kasenhis momentarily speechless. Finally, he decided to flip the metaphorical table. Then how exactly did you get their hair? He demanded. The Paddle sisters simultaneously turned their gazes toward the twins. Oh. The Paddle twins quickly turned to Kasenhis in confusion. Professor? What's going on here? Don't tell me you stole it without even telling them. Looking at the Paddle twins' confused expression, Kasen was now looking at the Weasley twins with some understanding. Damn, I think it's only fair you face some consequences for stealing their hair, Kasenhis said, raising an eyebrow and giving the Paddle twins a knowing look that said destroy them. After delivering this line, Kasenhis leaned over to Cedric and whispered discreetly, time to run move. With that, Kasenhis quickly led Cedric out of the chaotic classroom. Once outside, not only did he lock the door behind him, but he also reinforced it by sealing it shut with solid obsidian. Perfect, Kasenhis said, dusting off his hands with satisfaction. Professor, isn't this a bit too cruel? Cedric asked hesitantly. Cruel? Kasenhis pressed his ear against the obsidian barrier, trying to catch any sounds from inside. I think it's fine. Besides, do you really believe that 2 first-year witches could seriously harm the twins? Cedric shook his head. Not at all. Chapter 55 I was just being polite. Soon, Kasenhis knocked off the 2 pieces of obsidian and released all 4 of them. The twins emerged completely unscathed, as expected. The Paddle sisters, on the other hand, stood right in front of Kasenhis, looking sheepish. Now, let's talk. Why were you skipping class? Kasenhis asked, crossing his arms. Professor, we weren't skipping class. We took leave, Parvati explained. Where's the leave note, then? Here. Kasenhis took the leave note and glanced at it. A sick leave, followed by magic practice. Well, it's just that Professor Snape is too intimidating. We'd honestly rather endure Professor Quirrell's garlic stench, one of the Paddle sisters admitted hesitantly. But Snape's professional competence is undeniable, far better than Quirrell's. He even signed this leave note. Just make sure not to deceive your professors like this again, Kasenhis said as he handed the note back to the sisters. Professor, where should we go next? The Paddle sisters asked, still eager to continue their magic practice in the empty classroom. After this, Kasenhis decided to finally drop his patient facade. He strutted back to his office and collapsed into his recliner, exuding an air of utter relaxation. Now this is the life, he muttered contentedly. Truly. Professor, want some water chestnuts? Cedric asked, holding a few freshly washed ones from a basin. No, I've had enough for one day. You enjoy them. I'm fine just relaxing here with a book, Kasenhis replied with a dismissive wave. The pleasant atmosphere seemed destined to last forever until Hermione finished her class. She and her companions came charging toward the office at a speed that would have baffled Einstein. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. A loud, terrifying knock echoed through the office, causing Kasenhis to sit bolt upright in his chair. What's going on? One of you, check it out, he said, gesturing toward the door. No need to check. It's probably Granger and her lot. Wait, where's our potion? George Weasley rummaged through his pocket and quickly pulled out an empty bottle of Polyjuice Potion 1 missing the critical hair ingredient. Without hesitation, Kasenhis yanked out one of his own hairs and tossed it into the bottle. I'm giving you the opportunity of a lifetime, Hermione personally feeding you water chestnuts. Pick someone quickly. I'm outta here. Throwing on his coat, Kasenhis vanished from the office with a thunderous boom. Left behind, the remaining 3 quickly settled the matter of who would take the potion. It wasn't even a contest, George was too fast. Before Cedric could react, the potion was poured directly into his mouth. Be a brother. Take one for the team. The Weasley twins spoke in unison as they pinned poor Cedric to the bed. Meanwhile, that's the gist of it. Shamelessly, I sold out the three of them and decided to crash here for a bit. Got any novels around? Kasenhis asked casually. Second row on the bookshelf, Dumbledore replied, smiling as he stirred his coffee with a teaspoon. But I've enchanted them. You won't see the covers, you'll have to pick a book based on instinct. It's like a lucky draw. Most people use magic to make life easier, but your magic always seems to encourage you to savor life, Kasenhis remarked, unusually tactful. Thank you for putting it so kindly. The last few people who found out about my methods just looked at me with what I can only describe as pity. I've no idea why, Dumbledore said, sounding amused but slightly exasperated. Well, I have an idea. Kasen said, but then shook his head. Never mind. The Count of Monte Cristo? Never got around to reading this one, Kasenhis mused, pulling a book at random. Well, you're lucky. The last time Phileas came here looking for a book, he ended up with an introduction to advanced mathematics. Poor guy. I just want to pass the time and fast forward to curfew. The enthusiasm of these young kids is a bit overwhelming, you know, Kasenhis said bitterly. Dumbledore shook his head and took a sip of coffee. You don't realize how many people envy you. Now I suddenly feel a bit proud. What should I do about that? Perhaps go back and embrace the students' enthusiasm. Dumbledore suggested with a twinkle in his eye. Well, that's a separate matter entirely, Kasenhis muttered. Then, for some reason, he thought he heard a faint chuckle from Dumbledore. Are you laughing at me? No, of course not. Then what were you just laughing at? Kasenhis pressed. The cover of this book is quite amusing. Spending the rest of his time at Dumbledore's office, Kasenhis finally let the hours slip by until curfew. Feeling victorious about his little escape, he leisurely left the headmaster's office and began strolling toward the Hogwarts kitchen. The entrance to the kitchen was something Dumbledore had shared with him. After a day under Hermione's watchful eye, enduring her so-called healthy meals, Kasenhis was desperate for something rich in oil, sugar, and salt, proper junk food to revive his parched taste buds. Truly, a day of healthy food had left his palate completely dried out. Good evening, Professor Kasenhis. What can I get for you? A house elf clad in Hogwarts crested attire approached politely. Bring me some junk food, Kasenhis said bluntly. The elf's face instantly filled with alarm, shaking its head vigorously. No, no, no. Impossible, Professor Kasenhis. The Hogwarts kitchen could never produce junk. That's absolutely out of the question. All right then, what about fried chicken or something similar? Please pack some for me. Thanks, Kasenhis quickly rephrased. Oh, of course, kind Professor Kasenhis. But you absolutely don't need to use formal language with us. You only need to. The house elf was clearly a chatterbox. As it bustled around the kitchen, pulling out ingredients and seasonings to prepare food, it kept up a non-stop stream of conversation with Kasenhis. Before long, Kasenhis left the kitchen, holding a grease-stained paper bag packed to the brim with food, and headed back to his office. After spending most of the day confined to bed, he realized one thing: people shouldn't be too lazy. Sometimes, taking a walk was far better than lying around. When he returned to his office, however, he was met with an unusual sight, a mirror, or rather, poor Cedric. It wasn't actually a mirror, of course. If George or Fred had been the one under the polyjuice potion, there would undoubtedly have been a third Kasenhis by now causing trouble. But no, there were only two Kasenhis present. Patting Cedric on the shoulder, Kasenhis casually picked up a glass. With a flick of his hand, it was suddenly filled to the brim with milk. You've had a rough day, Kasenhis said sympathetically. Cedric shook his head. Not at all, Professor. Kasenhis's eyes lit up. Really? You think this is fine? That's great. Forget drinking the milk, how about staying in disguise for another day tomorrow? What? Professor, can't you see I was just being polite? Cedric's expression nearly cracked under the strain. Didn't see that. Hey. Chapter 56, just take it away. Well, yes, the best performer today is Hufflepuff, especially Cedric. He earned 47 points for Hufflepuff, excellent work. A week after recovering, during his first class back, Kasenhis generously awarded points to Hufflepuff for various reasons, all using Cedric as the starting point. By the end of class, Hufflepuff had gained a whopping 47 points. It was, without a doubt, a significant haul. And it was all well-deserved by Cedric. Yes, absolutely well-deserved. After finishing the last class of the day, Kasenhis strolled back to his office with a spring in his step, this time openly and without a care in the world. He no longer had to worry about suddenly encountering young witches giving him those motherly looks at his seemingly thin trousers. Because wearing thermal underwear was truly uncomfortable. Once back in his office, his attention was drawn to a package sitting on the windowsill. At this time of year, it can't possibly be a Christmas gift. Kasenhis muttered, scrutinizing the package with a curious gaze. Soon, he made the same choice as Rita Skeeter would. He constructed a sealed, explosion-proof space using obsidian and then carefully manipulated small blocks inside to open the package. He pressed his ear against the obsidian barrier, listening intently for any sounds of explosions or traces of dark magic. When all seemed clear, he finally retracted the obsidian shield. Inside the package was a small redstone figurine, running in place. Its chest bore a golden lightning bolt, seemingly engraved from gold galleons. Inside the package was also a card with 4 names written on it. Harry, Hermione, Ron, Neville. I'm actually quite touched, Kasenhis murmured as he carefully placed the flash-like figurine on a corner of his desk. After enchanting it with durability using the enchanting table, he covered it with a glass dome. Perfect. Knock, knock, knock. Just as he was leaning back in his office chair, admiring the figurine, the sound of someone knocking on the door interrupted him. Come in, Kasenhis called. Professor Kasenhis, this is a letter for you. It came from the Olori, a 5th-year Ravenclaw student said, stepping inside with an envelope in hand. Thank you, James. How have you been recently? Kasenhis asked, taking the letter as James placed it on the desk. James nodded politely. I heard you've recovered. Whenever we get to have your lessons, things are great. And right now? Right now, well, it's not bad, of course. But with Professor Dumbledore teaching we can't exactly relax. Not that Professor Dumbledore doesn't teach well, he does, it's just not as fun. Of course, what does Dumbledore know about alchemy anyway? Kasenhis nodded, looking every bit like a student used to getting scolded by a teacher. The first time a student is reprimanded, they're timid and afraid to even look up. By the 5th time, they've adapted, thinking it's fine if they're not scolded, but okay if they are. By the 10th time, they've embraced it, even beginning to enjoy the spotlight-like attention of the teacher's glare. Kasenhis had clearly reached the last stage. He could now shamelessly declare, what does Dumbledore know about alchemy anyway? Without a trace of the fear he'd had when first stepping into the magical world as a clueless newcomer. I won't let Dumbledore hear about that, don't worry, Professor, James replied with a grin. Honestly, it wouldn't be a big deal if he found out, Kasenhis shrugged. Then can I tell him? Better not. Got it, Professor, James chuckled, giving a small nod before leaving the office, closing the door behind him. Kasenhis glanced down at the envelope. It was from the European Alchemy Association. Opening it, he pulled out the letter and scanned the contents. The gist: the association was inviting him to France to give a lecture on the enchanting table. As for why it was France, the letter mentioned that Nicolas Flamel would also be attending, but he didn't like traveling too far from home. Time: this Saturday, 7 p.m., in the Grand Hall of the French Ministry of Magic. Kasenhis uncharacteristically fell silent. It wasn't that he was debating whether or not to go, instead, his gaze shifted toward his wardrobe. He was pondering what formal attire to wear for this upcoming lecture. This one won't do. They took a lot of photos of this one at the previous association banquet. This one either. I got the medal in this one. Pulling every garment out of the wardrobe and inspecting them thoroughly, he realized that all his outfits had either already been worn for significant occasions or were too casual for this event. Dumbledore. How tall are you? Kasenhis suddenly burst into Dumbledore's office, asking bluntly. 5 feet 11 inches, which is roughly 1 meter 80. Why? Dumbledore replied, looking puzzled. Stand up for a moment, let me see, Kasenhis insisted. Dumbledore set down the coffee cup he'd been holding and stood up. Is there a problem? The European Alchemy Association invited me to France to give a lecture. But I need a new robe for the occasion. The ones I already have all been worn before, so I'm here to see if you have a formal robe I can borrow, Kasenhis explained. Why don't you go to a proper tailor? Or ask Severus? Dumbledore inquired. There's no time, I'm warning you, Dumbledore. I asked Severus how much the previous alchemy professor was paid, and I suggest you have all those lovely galleons ready for me by the start of next term. Kasenhis retorted. Dumbledore awkwardly tried to change the topic. I meant borrowing robes from Severus. Also, aren't you capable of making your own through alchemy? I'm not interested in wrecking the fragile financial system of the magical world. Besides, doing so would definitely get me scolded by my peers in the Alchemy Association. Kasenhis grumbled before muttering under his breath, as for Severus, I already asked him. He's 6 centimeters taller than me. 6. He's definitely using shoe lifts. Still grumbling, Kasenhis pulled Dumbledore to his feet and stood behind him, back to back, straightening his posture for comparison. I think it's close enough. Don't you? Kasenhis asked. Fine, follow me. I recall ordering a ready-made set of robes last autumn. I haven't worn them yet, but you can give them a try, Dumbledore replied. Soon. Dumbledore, why do all your clothes glow? Kasenhis asked, baffled. It wasn't some magical aura from enchantments, it was the literal shimmer of the material. Elaborate patterns, embedded gemstones, golden threads hidden in embroidery, everything sparkled. Are you a niffler? You don't think they look good? Kasenhis said nothing, silently and slowly walking out of the headmaster's office. You're giving up on the robes. I think, maybe, occasionally crafting a bit of gold might not be entirely unreasonable after all. He trailed off, his gaze landing on a small pouch sitting on Dumbledore's desk. He slowly reached over, opened the pouch, and peeked inside. Dumbledore, ahem, just take it away. Chapter 57 Nicolas Flamel. Paying 70 galleons for a rush order robe, this is daylight robbery, isn't it? At the French Ministry of Magic's Grand Hall, Kasenhis pointed to his robe, shimmering with a faint purple magical glow, and complained to Ollivander beside him. Ollivander simply smiled without saying a word. Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions gave discounts for students due to subsidies, which made them affordable. However, at the normal rate, 70 galleons, while steep, wasn't entirely unreasonable considering Madame Malkin had worked overtime to make the robe. Charging extra for urgent orders wasn't a crime. Caught between a long-time associate and an up-and-coming alchemy star, Ollivander decided it was best to keep his mouth shut. Sometimes, silence truly was golden. By the way, have you prepared your speech? This isn't like those award ceremonies. Treat it like your classroom lecture or even a thesis defense, Ollivander added. I didn't prepare anything. Honestly, I haven't even written the thesis. Why do you think I was only credited as a supervising professor on those 2 papers before? Kasenhis shrugged. Wait, you were serious about that? I thought you were just being modest, Ollivander said, stunned. Heh, what else? Do you enjoy writing papers? Documenting your knowledge in writing is a captivating experience. You should try writing one yourself. Trust me, you'd fall in love with it. All right, I'll give it a shot when I have time, Kasenhis nodded. Before he could say more, a staff member from the French Ministry of Magic approached him. The staff member led Kasenhis to the raised platform in the Grand Hall. There stood a podium, and behind it was an enormous magical holographic display device allegedly sponsored generously by Nicolas Flamel himself. Please begin, Professor Kasenhis. I've noticed your students enjoy addressing you that way, said an elderly, thin man with long, unkempt white hair, smiling warmly from the audience. Ahaha, you're not a student, Mr. Flamel, Kasenhis waved modestly, summoning a standard-issue enchanting table onto the stage. The basic structure of an enchanting table is incredibly simple, Kasenhis began, and I've received many letters at Hogwarts about successful attempts to replicate enchanting tables. So, we won't go over the basic structure again here. Instead, let's dive straight into the principles of enchantment. As you know, the principle lies in the use of runic scripts, though it's not limited to those. We can also directly infuse spells into items. For example, a sword enchanted with flaming fury. The downside? That sword would be useless for cutting butter, it would melt too quickly, and then vaporize entirely. And besides, does he always veer off topic like this? Someone in the audience murmured. Isn't he a professor? All professors have this quirk. My old professor used to steer every lecture toward his disastrous honeymoon, came another reply. Are professors the same all over the world? Probably. Back when I was a professor. As the murmurs continued in the audience, Kasenhis stepped off the podium, casually grabbing a drink from the self-serve bar. He took a sip to soothe his throat. Ha! Giving a lecture to these alchemy bigs-hots was a far cry from teaching young wizards. It was far more challenging. As Kasenhis mulled over this, he noticed a thin, frail figure walking toward him. It was none other than Nicolas Flamel. To be honest, the moment Kasenhis saw Flamel, he didn't even dare to breathe loudly. Not out of some starstruck reverence for a legendary alchemist, but purely because he was terrified that if he puffed out a bit too much air, he might accidentally blow the old man away. Honestly, have you ever considered crafting yourself a magical wheelchair or something like that? Kasenhis asked cautiously. Ahaha! Flamel shook his head with a gentle smile. Of course not. The secret to staying healthy as an elderly man is regular physical activity. And the same goes for young folks, too. Kasenhis nodded in agreement and reached for a glass of vodka from the drinks shelf to offer Flamel. Let me clarify. That advice does not include unhealthy exercises for your stomach, Flamel remarked, waving his hand dismissively. Fair enough, Kasenhis replied, pouring the vodka straight into his own whiskey glass. The two distilled spirits blended together into a strange concoction. It tasted terrible. Kasenhis made a mental note to never, under any circumstances, repeat that particular experiment in his lifetime. This morning, Dumbledore sent me a letter recommending a talented young man like yourself, Flamel began, as though searching his pockets for the letter. A remarkable young talent, he said. I think I may have left it at home, though. Kasenhis stared blankly at Flamel. You're just going to stand there and stare at me like that? Wouldn't that be something? Kasenhis chuckled. Most people, when they see me like this, rush to tell me not to bother searching. Perhaps they're afraid I'll strain my back, or they simply trust me enough to believe I wouldn't lie about something so trivial, Nicolas Flamel said, his tone light but amused. Well, if you want to look, go ahead, Kasenhis replied casually. What I mean is, perhaps you should offer me an excuse to stop looking, because I didn't bring the letter with me today, Flamel admitted with a sly grin. You could have just said so from the start, Kasenhis replied, a bit exasperated as he stared at the elderly alchemist. It all clicked now. Flamel and Dumbledore got along so well because they were both the quintessential cheeky old men. However, all of that was just an icebreaker, Flamel continued. You can think of it as a way for me to ease into the conversation without things getting awkward. I came to find you because I have a question. Dumbledore mentioned that you don't need a philosopher's stone or complex alchemical rituals to transmute anything into gold. Kasenhis gave him a faint smile, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a simple feather quill. Something like that, he said. Holding the quill in his hand, he let golden magic slowly spread from his fingers up the quill, transforming the entire feather into solid gold. Flamel took the golden quill, turning it over in his hands, inspecting it carefully. He squeezed it slightly, then bent it to test its malleability. Thank goodness I didn't meet you in my youth, Flamel finally said, his tone carrying both amazement and humor. If I had seen this before I created the Philosopher's Stone, I would have absolutely given up on alchemy altogether. I thought you'd charge forward, undeterred, like a hero in the face of adversity, Kasenhis quipped. Nicolas Flamel waved his hand dismissively. Don't believe the glowing praise in the alchemy textbooks about me. I'm not nearly that magnanimous. The truth is, the reason I've come this far is twofold. First, because I do have exceptional talent, and second, because of that talent, my journey has been paved with flowers and applause at nearly every step. If it had been mud and insults instead, Flamel continued with a self-deprecating chuckle, Nicolas Flamel would have long since crumbled into dust. Kasenhis raised an eyebrow. I'll make a note of that. Chapter 58 Dumbledore knows nothing about alchemy? Did Dumbledore ever show you the Philosopher's Stone? Nicolas Flamel asked again. Yes, he did, and he even had me counterfeit it once, Kasenhis replied with a nod. You counterfeited it? Oh. For him. Yes. Do you want to hear his name? If you don't, I won't say it. There's no need, you don't have to say it. I already know who you mean. How did you counterfeit it? Flamel's curiosity clearly piqued. Kasenhis reached into his pocket and pulled out a chunk of redstone. With this, Flamel took the redstone and weighed it in his hand, scrutinizing it closely. Finally, he let out a sigh of relief. It's just an energy block, after all. If you could make a philosopher's stone as easily as you make gold, I'd honestly need to find a rope and end it right here. Still, it looks close enough, Kasenhis explained. You've made the real thing, so you can tell the difference, but most people wouldn't have a clue. It's very useful for baiting traps. Did Dumbledore ever tell you what he planned to do with the real philosopher's stone? Flamel inquired. No, he didn't, and I didn't ask. When he's done with it, you should ask him to hand it over to you, Flamel advised. That's the philosopher's stone you're talking about. Why does it sound like cabbage coming out of your mouth? Kasenhis asked, incredulous. Does Dumbledore know alchemy? The philosopher's stone can't show its true potential in his hands, Flamel said matter-of-factly. Besides, he has little regard for material possessions. From the way he mentioned you in his letters, it's clear he values you highly. Trust me, he'll give it to you. Kasenhis wholeheartedly agreed with the first point. Dumbledore didn't understand alchemy at all. The fact that he appointed the clueless me as a professor at that time proves it. But the latter part left him feeling a bit odd. He didn't doubt Dumbledore's indifference to external possessions on the surface, at least. But considering Dumbledore's penchant for extravagance, from his expensive robes and plush chairs to his half-moon glasses made of mithril and pure crystal, and the way he schemed off the salaries of new professors at the start of term, Kasenhis couldn't imagine the man giving away something for nothing. The last time Kasenhis had swiped 2 bottles of Dumbledore's prized liquor, he ended up dueling a dark wizard in the Forbidden Forest. If he managed to pry the Philosopher's Stone out of Dumbledore's hands, who knows what price he'd have to pay. Trust me, Flamel continued, you'll need a Philosopher's Stone in your future. Even if it shatters into dust in your hands, that would still be a more worthwhile use than it sitting in some ornate box collecting dust or being used solely to brew immortality elixirs and perform petty tricks like transmuting gold. I understand. I'll convince Dumbledore, Kasenhis said with a nod. Since someone as accomplished in alchemy as you holds me in such high regard, I suppose I should at least live up to that expectation. How do you plan to ask him? If Dumbledore refuses to hand over the Philosopher's Stone for free, I'll just wait until he's asleep and throw a sack over him. Kasenhis exhaled heavily as he spoke. Honestly, there's no need for that, really, Flamel quickly added. After a long silence, Kasenhis nodded. I'll keep your advice in mind. That's for the best, though I know you'll likely let it go in one ear and out the other. Talented folks like you are always like that. Dumbledore was the same in his youth, and that other one, never mind. Flamel trailed off, as if he had either forgotten or deliberately chosen not to say more. With his hands clasped behind his back, he slowly walked away. I just hope my temperament doesn't turn out so peculiar in the future. Must be something about studying alchemy, Kasenhis muttered to himself, watching the elderly alchemist wander off, his tone filled with harmless teasing. The evening banquet wrapped up quickly. The crowd wasn't exactly youthful. Besides Kasenhis, the youngest person there was 33. This wasn't the sort of event to devolve into a wild party lasting until dawn. People kept things simple, sipping drinks, nibbling on tiny cakes or snacks if they were peckish, and then dispersing. Kasenhis followed an organizer to a suite prepared by the French Ministry of Magic. Upon entering, he had to admit it was impressively luxurious, almost reminiscent of a high-end Muggle hotel. After a quick shower, he nearly dozed off in the bathtub. Barely managing to drag himself to the bed, he collapsed onto it, and within seconds, sleep claimed him. He was truly exhausted. The next morning, Kasenhis was awakened by the arrival of breakfast. Normally, he had a mild case of morning grumpiness, not to the point of snapping at people, but certainly not one to greet anyone with a smile, especially those bringing breakfast. But then the staff presented him with an authentic French breakfast. To be honest, when compared to this, the Hogwarts morning fare of dry bread, rock-hard bacon that might as well have been carved out of redstone, and flavorless, water-thin fried eggs seemed laughably inadequate. Does the French wizarding school happen to need an alchemy professor? Kasenhis asked earnestly, looking up at the staff member. Oh my! If you're truly interested, I believe Beauxbatons would gladly reassign their current alchemy professor to care for the Abraxans, just to warmly welcome you. Shall I draft a letter to convey your interest? The ministry staff member produced a piece of parchment and a quill, ready to write a message on the spot, leaning against the door frame. No need for that, sir, truly. I was just expressing my admiration. And let me say, I'm genuinely in awe of your French cuisine." Kasenhis hurriedly stopped the well-meaning man. It was only then that the staff member seemed to recall that Kasenhis was English. His expression softened into one of pity, as though suddenly understanding the culinary plight of his guest. After a moment's thought, he retrieved another plate of breakfast from the cart and handed it over. "Thank you, generous sir. May Merlin bless you." Kasenhis stood at the door, holding 2 plates of breakfast, and watched as the breakfast night gradually disappeared down the hallway. Only then did he return to the suite and begin to enjoy his meal. After finishing breakfast, he had to head downstairs. The gathering of the Alchemy Association's full membership this time was no small feat, so the alchemy big shots had come up with a spur-of-the-moment activity, a group outing to explore the Muggle side of France. Kasenhis found the idea refreshingly agreeable. Since he was already here, he figured he might as well pick up some souvenirs for his students. However, when he shared this thought and asked where the French Gringotts was located, he learned that the association was footing the bill for the entire outing. They had already exchanged a massive amount of gold galleons for French francs. In that case, I guess I can pick up gifts for the professors too. Chapter 59 WA.DA.FK? Thud. 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 I really ought to mention this to Dumbledore. Professor Kasen hasn't been at Hogwarts lately, yet his office keeps making these bizarre noises like someone is tossing things around inside, Filch muttered as he led the Gryffindor quartet toward Professor McGonagall's office. Hearing the eerie noises coming from Kasen's office, Filch couldn't help but voice his thoughts. Could it be that something went wrong with one of Professor Kasen's alchemy experiments? Hermione suggested hesitantly. Filch paused mid-stride, considering her words, then shook his head after a moment. Even if that's the case, we should report it to Dumbledore first. Don't tell me you think you know more about alchemy than he does. Well, actually, I have been studying alchemy. Hermione started, but Filch cut her off. That doesn't matter one bit. Your so-called alchemy can't even compare to Professor Kasen's, you hear me? The lamp he gave me last semester is still glowing brightly to this day, hasn't needed refueling once. Hermione nodded, albeit reluctantly. I understand your admiration for Professor Kasen, Mr. Filch, but listen to those sounds. Don't you think they're a little too strange? Filch furrowed his brows, finally conceding to her point. He pressed his ear against the office door, trying to discern the source of the noise. Inside, the thundering sounds rumbled on, wave after wave. The sound is too terrifying. I'm going to find Dumbledore. You lot stay here and don't even think about running. If you do, I'll have no choice but to go to Professor McGonagall to bring you back. Filch snarled at the 4 students, glaring at them for emphasis before rushing off toward Dumbledore's office. So should we run? Ron proposed. I heard George and Fred say there's an unspoken rule at Hogwarts, if you break the rules but don't get caught, there's no punishment. Sorry to disappoint you, Ron, Hermione said with a regretful shake of her head, but we've already been caught. While Hermione and Ron debated, the other 2, Harry and Neville, had already started to act. They were attempting to use the Alohomora spell to unlock the door. However, Kasen's office door wasn't equipped with a typical mechanical or magical lock. Instead, it was secured with a redstone lock. The Alohomora spell, unfortunately, had no effect on such a system. Wait, a redstone lock? Harry suddenly realized something. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small red cube. Hermione, do you know the disassembly charm? He asked. Hermione rolled her eyes. The last time we messed with Professor Kasen's office, we almost turned the place upside down. The professor didn't even hold it against us. And now you want to dismantle his lock? Harry shrugged. Dumbledore's already on his way, and this door's going to get opened one way or another. If we use redstone to open it now, at least we can put the cover back on before anyone notices. Fine, Hermione relented, finally swayed by Harry's logic. She pulled out her wand, pointed it at the lock, and muttered an incantation. The lock's casing fell off, revealing a dense network of redstone wiring, along with tiny levers, pressure plates, and buttons arranged intricately. The locking mechanism was reinforced with several blocks of obsidian and pistons. Got it open. Now how are you planning to unlock the mechanism? Ron asked. Didn't Professor Kasen teach us this before? Use redstone, Harry replied confidently, pulling out a small chunk of redstone. He pressed it directly onto the redstone dust circuit, and as the dust glowed faintly, the pistons and obsidian components of the lock mechanism retracted smoothly. Harry turned to Hermione and the others with a triumphant grin. "See? I've got a knack for alchemy, don't I?" "You do. Now, esteemed alchemist, kindly open the door," Hermione replied, nodding with mock seriousness. "Oh, right," Harry said, pulling the door open. The next moment, an avalanche of gifts spilled out, burying all four of them under a mountain of brightly wrapped packages. At that moment, Filch arrived with the finally appearing Dumbledore in tow. Well, it seems you've all been buried under an ocean of happiness," Dumbledore remarked, bending down to pick up a large gift box adorned with ribbons and a handwritten card. "This one's from Kasen, for you," he said, handing the gift to Filch. Filch's hands trembled slightly as he took the gift, standing there for a moment in stunned silence before instinctively starting to open it. Thankfully, Dumbledore stopped him. "Hold on, Argus. Wait for Kasen to return. Let him give this to you personally. The joy on your face will undoubtedly be a gift to him as well." Filch quickly set the gift down, nodding fervently. "You're absolutely right, Professor Dumbledore." Dumbledore smiled and turned to the four students, who were cautiously emerging from the mountain of presents. "I wonder, when Kasen learns you managed to bypass his lock, will he marvel at your talent or feel sorry for this poor lock and decide to give it a new casing?" "Don't worry, Professor, we'll fix it," Neville said, holding the fallen outer casing of the lock in his hand. With the small incident of the lock put aside, everyone turned their attention toward the source of the ever-growing mountain of gifts. In the corner of Kasen's office, a spot kept spitting out presents like a relentless fountain. Dumbledore used magic to clear away the pile of gifts that blocked their view, revealing a dark green, ornate chest from which the endless cascade originated. I remember Kasen's ring looking almost identical to that box, just a bit smaller." "Well then, have you all satisfied your curiosity?" Dumbledore asked, casting a knowing glance at the four students. The four of them scratched the back of their heads sheepishly, avoiding eye contact. "Good. Now that you've seen enough, it's time to leave this delightful mess for our fashionably late Professor Kasen to handle," Dumbledore said with a small smile. With a wave of his hand, the flood of presents stacked themselves neatly into an orderly pile in the middle of the office. But, as if to mock their efforts, another freshly ejected gift tumbled out and immediately disrupted the neat pile. "Quickly, lock that door. Or else we'll be buried again," Dumbledore said urgently to Harry. Harry reacted fast, using the redstone to re-trigger the circuit and causing the lock to retract for 3 seconds. Taking the opportunity, he slammed the door shut and quickly reattached the outer casing to secure it. With the office finally sealed, the chaotic event was brought to a close. Under Dumbledore's persuasion, Filch reluctantly abandoned his plans to march Harry and the others to McGonagall's office. Once again, the hallway outside the alchemy professor's office fell silent, undisturbed until the approaching dusk. Buzz Ender teleports sound. Thump. 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 WA.DAFK. Chapter 60 Distributing Presents. I mean, what the actual fuck? Kasen stood in the hallway, staring at his office, which was now so packed with gifts that there was barely any room to stand. "Ha! I've overestimated the capacity of the Ender chest. Next time, I should just get a bigger one," he sighed, waving his wand to start organizing the chaotic mountain of gifts with magic. The next day. This time, the Alchemy Association's team-building activity was a shopping trip in a Muggle city in France. "So, I didn't get you any magical trinkets. After all, that'd be as dull as an Englishman going to France to look for an English restaurant. Now then, Cedric, please hand out these gifts." Kasen snapped his fingers, and the neatly organized pile of presents appeared on the lectern. Meanwhile, he casually took a seat in the chair behind it. He had already decided that if Cedric moved any slower, he could easily spend the entire lesson slacking off. However, Cedric's speed was shockingly efficient. In about 2 minutes, he distributed every single gift to its intended recipient and returned to his seat, ready for Kasen to begin the lesson. "Tisk. You really didn't have to be that quick. Don't you want to savor a bit of downtime during class?" Kasen said, a bit awkwardly, as he stood and picked up a piece of chalk. The students below shook their heads in unison. "Well, fine then. Since you all love my classes so much, let's have a test." "Hey! After class, Kasen contentedly carried a stack of test papers back to his office. By the end of the morning, he had successfully distributed all the gifts meant for the young wizards and witches. Now, only the gifts for his fellow professors were left. Armed with a gift box the size of a wash basin, he went from one office to another. Although he wasn't sure if his colleagues would appreciate Muggle gifts, at least Snape, upon receiving a complete set of precision scales and weights, had shown a rare smile. Finally, he arrived at Filch's office. "I've noticed that some of the students tend to dirty the castle walls, so I made you this. It has an internal infinite magic circuit, and inside, there's a blue glowing strip that performs a cleaning charm. When you need to use it, just press the red button on top, and the light will shine on the stain to clean it." Filch accepted the gift box with trembling hands. Thank you, Professor Kasen. "You're welcome. No big deal. Well, I need to get going. I still have to deliver Dumbledore's wool socks. I bought him 200 pairs in one go." Oh, of course, no problem at all, Professor Kasen." The last gift he delivered was to Dumbledore, though not because of any special reason, simply because reaching the headmaster's office required climbing an absurdly long staircase. "Dumbledore, come look at the socks I got for you. You can wear a new pair every day for over half a year, Dumbledore." Kasen stood dumbfounded in the empty headmaster's office. But if the headmaster isn't home?" Kasen slowly turned his head toward Dumbledore's cabinet, where the headmaster kept his private stash of liquor. Hum. Humming a cheerful tune, he strolled over to the cabinet and began rummaging through it. Before long, he pulled out 2 bottles of what looked like exceptionally fine wine, along with a magical wine storage box that could simulate ideal temperature and humidity conditions. Kakeek! What a great find! Kasen removed the wine box and left it behind, reasoning that these 2 bottles wouldn't survive long enough in his possession to require such preservation. Meanwhile, "We need to see Dumbledore. We have something really important to tell him." 2 of Gryffindor's quartet, Harry and Neville, had appeared before the stone gargoyle guarding the entrance to the headmaster's office, looking visibly anxious. However, the ever-dutiful gargoyle statues showed no inclination to respond to them, perhaps because they couldn't actually speak in such situations, who knew? In any case, the pair were effectively stone-walled. "All right, this confirms it. That portrait wasn't lying. Dumbledore really isn't in Hogwarts right now." Soon enough, the other 2 members of the quartet, Hermione and Ron, came running up to join them. "Professor Kasen's office is empty. Ron and I used redstone to get in and check he's not there." "That settles it. The other professors don't believe us when we tell them, but wait a second, why do we even need to go to the other professors? Why don't we handle this ourselves?" Harry suddenly realized. "Do you guys agree? Professor Kasen once told us that when making a decision, we should calculate its pros and cons. Between the Philosopher's Stone and our lives, which do you think he'd want us to prioritize?" Hermione reminded them at just the right moment. "And what would you choose? Even knowing that Professor Kasen would want us to prioritize our lives?" Neville asked. "I'd choose the Philosopher's Stone not because it's so valuable, but because I believe letting such a powerful alchemical artifact fall into the hands of a dark wizard like Quirrell would be absolutely catastrophic," Harry declared firmly. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's go." The 4 of them ran all the way to the 3rd-floor corridor. The door to the room housing the 3-headed dog was wide open, and music drifted out. Harry peeked inside and sighed in relief. "The big dog's asleep. Let's get in quickly." Meanwhile, "Wine? Oh, no, thank you, Kasen. I've never really cared for wine. It feels too bland to me, hardly like alcohol, more like grape juice, you know." Hagrid, lounging on his sofa, politely declined Kasen's offer to share some wine. "You might want to try it for the novelty of it," Kasen encouraged. "Honestly, I just can't appreciate this sort of thing. And looking at it, this wine seems pretty fancy. To be honest, me drinking it would feel like a waste. You should share it with someone who can truly appreciate it." No, Kasen quickly waved his hands dismissively. "The most important thing about drinking is enjoying yourself. If you let notions of value or worth get in the way of having a good time, that's the real insult to the wine." "Oh, hearing you say that, I'm actually a bit moved," said the ever-sensitive Hagrid, his voice suddenly tinged with emotion. Kasen's sharp eye caught the telltale signs of the big fellow gearing up for one of his signature bear hugs, and the sight terrified him. Quickly, he waved his wand and summoned 2 wine glasses from across the room. No need for the hugs. If you feel like the wine's lacking, maybe go grab a couple barrels of ale instead, Kasen suggested hurriedly. All right. Maybe I should find some time to work on controlling my strength. I've noticed none of you seem to want me hugging you, Hagrid muttered as he ambled toward the door. That's because your hugs, Hagrid, could literally crush someone to death. Honestly, with fully grown wizards, it's fine, but with the little ones? Merlin's beard, you might actually pop one like a balloon. Kasen said matter-of-factly.
Thanks for listening.